On the night of August 17, 2022, a heinous act shattered the Hillcrest community, leaving them reeling and exposing the dark underbelly of family dysfunction and deadly manipulation. Caleb Ruffalo was the golden boy, handsome, successful, and recently married to the beautiful Aria Landon. They were the couple everyone aspired to be, their love story the stuff of local legend. Caleb's mother, Abigail Ruffalo, was a pillar of the community, known for her charity work and impeccable taste. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect family, but appearances can be deceiving. Caleb Ruffalo was born and raised in Hillcrest, the only child of Abigail and the late Gregory Ruffalo. From an early age, it was clear that Caleb was destined for greatness, at least in the eyes of his doting mother. Abigail Ruffalo had always been a force to be reckoned with. The daughter of one of Hillcrest's founding families, she carried herself with an air of superiority that both intimidated and fascinated her neighbors. When she married Gregory Ruffalo, a promising young lawyer, it seemed like the perfect match. But Gregory's untimely death when Caleb was just 7 left Abigail a widow, intensifying her already fierce devotion to her only child. Abigail's love was all-encompassing, bordering on obsessive. She micromanaged every aspect of his life, from his clothes to his friends to his extracurricular activities. In high school, Caleb was an athlete and top student, but those who knew him well saw the toll his mother's expectations took on him. Jasper, Caleb's childhood best friend, later recalled, "There were times when I'd see this look in Caleb's eyes like he was drowning and couldn't call for help, but then he'd shake it off and be the perfect son again." It wasn't until Caleb left for college that he began to taste true independence. At the university, he flourished, discovering a passion for environmental law that would shape his future career. It was also where he met Aria Landon, a vivacious art history major with a quick wit and a dazzling smile. Their romance was the stuff of rom-coms. The charming, somewhat sheltered boy from a small town swept off his feet by the free-spirited city girl. Aria challenged Caleb in ways he'd never experienced before, encouraging him to question his assumptions and explore the world beyond Hillcrest's borders. For Caleb, it was love at first sight. For Abigail, it was a threat to everything she had built. When Caleb brought Aria home to Hillcrest for the first time, the tension was palpable. Abigail's smile never reached her eyes as she appraised the young woman who had captured her son's heart. Sharia, for her part, did her best to win over her boyfriend's mother, but it quickly became clear that nothing she did would ever be good enough. Despite Abigail's thinly veiled disapproval, Caleb and Aria's relationship blossomed. They married in a lavish ceremony 2 years after graduation, with all of Hillcrest in attendance. As Caleb kissed his bride, onlookers would later swear they saw a shadow cross Abigail's face. The newlyweds settled in Hillcrest, where Caleb joined a prestigious law firm, and Aria took a job curating the local art museum. From the outside, they seemed to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful home, and a love that appeared unshakable. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord were already taking root, nurtured by the relentless machinations of a woman who refused to let go of her son. For the first few years of their marriage, Caleb and Aria Ruffalo were the toast of Hillcrest. They were young, beautiful, and successful, the embodiment of the American dream. Their home on Willow Creek Lane became a hub for dinner parties and charity events, with Aria's artistic flair and Caleb's easy charm making them the perfect hosts. Professionally, they were equally impressive. Caleb quickly made a name for himself at Hillcrest, specializing in environmental law cases that often put him at odds with big corporations. His passionate advocacy and sharp legal mind earned him the respect of colleagues and opponents alike. Aria, meanwhile, breathed new life into the art museum, curating exhibits that drew visitors from all over the state and put their small town on the cultural map. Eliza, owner of the local bakery and a close friend of the couple, remembered those early days fondly. They were like something out of a movie. The way they looked at each other even after years of marriage, it was magical. We all wanted what they had. But as with all things that seemed too good to be true, cracks began to appear in the Ruffalo's perfect facade. Observant neighbors noticed the increasing frequency of Abigail Ruffalo's visits to her son's home, often arriving unannounced and staying for hours. Aria, always polite but clearly strained, would paste on a smile as her mother-in-law critiqued everything from her housekeeping to her career choices. Caleb, caught between his wife and the woman who had shaped his entire existence, often found himself playing peacemaker. He'd soothe Aria's hurt feelings after particularly cutting remarks from Abigail, then turn around and defend his mother's intentions to his wife. It was a delicate balancing act, and one that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Friends began to notice subtle changes in the couple's dynamics. Arya, once vivacious and outgoing, grew quieter at social gatherings, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Caleb, for his part, threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Late nights at the office became more frequent, as did the furrow in his brow when he thought no one was looking. To the casual observer, the Ruffalos were still the golden couple of Hillcrest, but those who looked closer could see the hairline fractures forming in their once unbreakable bond. Fractures that would soon split wide open under the relentless pressure of a mother's twisted love. The transformation of Caleb Ruffalo from doting husband to suspicious paranoid spouse didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, a slow poisoning of the mind orchestrated with chilling precision by the one person he trusted above all others, his mother. Abigail had always been a master of subtle manipulation, and she put all her skills to work in her campaign to drive a wedge between her son and his wife. It started innocuously enough, a casual mention of how late Arya was working at the museum, a seemingly offhand comment about the handsome new donor who seemed so taken with her daughter-in-law's expertise. At first, Caleb brushed off these remarks. He trusted Arya implicitly and knew how dedicated she was to her work. But Abigail was patient. She knew that doubt, once planted, has a way of taking root and growing in even the most fertile soil of love and trust. As weeks turned into months, Abigail's insinuations became more pointed. She'd call Caleb at odd hours, voice laden with concern, to report that she'd driven by the house and noticed Arya's car was gone. Or she'd mention, almost as an afterthought, that she'd seen Arya having lunch with a male colleague, their heads bent close together in what looked like an intimate conversation. Each seed of doubt she planted found purchase in Caleb's mind, fed by his own insecurities and the stress of his demanding career. He began to notice things he'd overlooked before, the way Arya's phone would sometimes buzz late at night, the new clothes she'd bought for work, the vague answers she gave when he asked about her day. Rosalind Patel, a paralegal at Caleb's firm, later recalled to the police about the subtle changes she observed in her colleague. Caleb had always been focused, but suddenly he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and disappearing for long lunches. I remember one day, I overheard him on the phone with his mother, and the look on his face, it was like he'd seen a ghost. As Caleb's suspicions grew, so did the distance between him and Arya. The easy intimacy they had once shared gave way to stilted conversations and long silences. Arya, sensing her husband's withdrawal but unsure of its cause, tried to bridge the growing gap between them. She suggested vacations, date nights, couples therapy, anything to recapture the closeness they had lost. But Caleb, his mind clouded by doubt and his ear filled with his mother's poisonous whispers, interpreted Arya's efforts as attempts to assuage her guilty conscience. Every loving gesture became suspect, every explanation a potential lie. In the echoing halls of the Ruffalo house, a clock was ticking down to tragedy, its ominous rhythm drowned out by the sound of a family falling apart. As Caleb's suspicions reached a fever pitch, Abigail Ruffalo set in motion the most audacious and horrifying phase of her plan. No longer content with mere insinuations, she embarked on an elaborate scheme to fabricate concrete evidence of Arya's infidelity. Evidence so compelling that it would shatter the last vestiges of trust between husband and wife. Abigail's first step was to create a digital trail of deception. Using her considerable financial resources, she hired a skilled hacker from the dark web to infiltrate Arya's phone and email accounts. This shadowy figure, known only by the alias Phantom, worked tirelessly to construct a false narrative of betrayal. Fabricated text messages appeared on Arya's phone, detailing clandestine meetings and passionate encounters with a fictional lover. Emails with suggestive subject lines and cryptic content materialized in her inbox. Even Arya's social media accounts were subtly altered, with likes and comments on an attractive male colleague's posts backdated to create the illusion of a long-standing flirtation. But Abigail knew that digital evidence alone might not be enough. She needed physical proof, tangible items that Caleb could see and touch, to drive home the reality of his wife's supposed betrayal. Enter Liam Howard, a down-on-his-luck actor Abigail had met at a local theater production. Charismatic but struggling to make ends meet, Liam was the perfect unwitting accomplice in Abigail's scheme. She approached him with what seemed like an innocent request, to pose for a few innocent photos with a local artist, Arya, for a community project. Liam, flattered by the attention and eager for the promised payment, agreed without hesitation. Over the course of several weeks, Abigail orchestrated chance encounters between Liam and Arya at the museum, at local cafes, even on the street. Each time she was there, hidden from view, snapping photos that, when taken out of context, could be interpreted as evidence of a budding romance. As a final touch, Abigail purchased items she knew would inflame Caleb's jealousy. A man's watch, not his style, but expensive and engraved with a lover's message. Hotel receipts for rooms never actually booked, a scrap of paper with a lipstick kiss, and an unfamiliar phone number. These items were carefully planted around the Ruffalo house. The watch accidentally dropped behind a dresser, the receipts stuffed in a rarely used desk drawer, the lipsticked paper hidden in the pages of one of Arya's art books. Throughout this elaborate deception, Abigail maintained an outward appearance of concern and support. To the outside world, she was the picture of a caring mother-in-law, expressing worry over the apparent distance growing between Caleb and Arya. This public persona served a dual purpose. It deflected any potential suspicion from herself, while also reinforcing the narrative of Arya's guilt in the minds of those around them. As Abigail's web of lies grew ever more complex, she remained eerily calm, meticulously checking and double-checking every aspect of her plan. She was so consumed by her goal of separating Caleb from Arya that she never stopped to consider the potentially devastating consequences of her actions. In her journal, later discovered by investigators, Abigail wrote, "I do this for Caleb. He cannot see how she has bewitched him, how she is wrong for him. I am his mother. I know what's best. One day he will thank me for saving him from her clutches." The stage was set, the players unknowingly in position. All that remained was for Abigail to present her evidence to Caleb and watch as her carefully constructed house of cards came crashing down around them all. August 17th, 2022, dawned like any other summer day in Hillcrest. The air was thick with humidity, promising afternoon thunderstorms. Caleb Ruffalo left for work early, his goodbye to Arya perfunctory and cold. Arya, her heart heavy with the weight of their unspoken issues, busied herself with preparations for an upcoming exhibition at the museum. Neither of them could have imagined the storm that was about to break over their lives. At precisely 2:17 p.m., Abigail Ruffalo called her son, her voice trembling with what seemed like genuine distress. "Caleb," she said, "you need to come home. There's something you have to see. It's about Arya. Please hurry." Caleb, his mind immediately jumping to the worst conclusions, left work without a word to his colleagues. He broke several speed limits on his way home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He found Abigail waiting for him in the driveway, her face a mask of sorrow and sympathy. Inside, she led him to the dining room table, where she had artfully arranged her collected evidence of Arya's infidelity. For nearly an hour, Abigail walked Caleb through her fabricated proof, weaving a tale of betrayal so convincing that it shattered the last remnants of his trust. She showed him the doctored photos, the fake text messages, the planted items, each piece of evidence driving the knife of betrayal deeper into his heart. "Caleb, I'm so sorry," Abigail said, her eyes brimming with crocodile tears. "I didn't want to believe it either. But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve better than this." As Abigail's words echoed in his ears, something inside Caleb snapped. Years of pent-up insecurity, of feeling not quite good enough, came rushing to the surface. The man who prided himself on his logical mind and calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a creature of pure primal rage. When Arya returned home at 6:45 p.m., she found Caleb waiting for her, his eyes wild, his body trembling with barely contained fury. The confrontation that followed was brutal and swift. Caleb hurled accusations at his bewildered wife, each word laced with venom and hurt. Arya, caught completely off guard, tried desperately to make sense of her husband's tirade. She denied the allegations, begged Caleb to listen to reason, to believe in their love. But Caleb was beyond reason, beyond love. In his mind, twisted by his mother's lies, Arya's denials were just further proof of her deceit. What happened next occurred in a matter of minutes, but would haunt the residents of Hillcrest for years to come. In a blind rage, Caleb lashed out physically at Arya for the first time in their relationship. He pushed her, her head striking the corner of the marble kitchen island with a sickening crack. Arya crumpled to the floor, a thin line of blood trickling from her temple. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, as the reality of what he'd done came crashing down on him, Caleb fell to his knees beside his wife's motionless body. As the police led a shell-shocked Caleb away in handcuffs, Abigail Ruffalo stood in the shadows of the house she had so meticulously filled with lies. Her face was a mask of horrified concern, but deep in her eyes, a flicker of triumph could be seen, a triumph that would prove to be devastatingly short-lived. The news of Arya Ruffalo's death sent shockwaves through Hillcrest. The community that had once looked up to Caleb and Arya as the perfect couple now found itself grappling with the ugly reality of domestic violence and murder. In the immediate aftermath, Caleb Ruffalo was arrested. He offered no resistance, seemingly in a state of shock as he was led away from the home he had shared with Arya. His initial statements to the police were disjointed and confused, alternating between professions of love for Arya and accusations of her infidelity. The investigation, led by Detective Imogen Qualley of the Oregon State Police, quickly focused on unraveling the events that had led to this tragic outcome. Qualley, a veteran investigator with a reputation for thoroughness, sensed early on that there was more to this case than a simple crime of passion. As news crews descended on Hillcrest, turning the quiet town into the center of a media frenzy, Detective Qualley and her team began the painstaking process of piecing together Caleb and Arya's final days. They interviewed friends, colleagues, and neighbors, building a picture of a couple that had seemed perfect on the surface but had been struggling with growing tensions. One of the first red flags came during the interview with Eliza Carruthers, the local baker who had been close to the couple. She mentioned offhandedly that she had seen Abigail Ruffalo at the Ruffalo residence on the day of the murder, leaving just before Caleb arrived home. This contradicted Abigail's initial statement that she had only come to the house after receiving a distressed call from her son. As they dug deeper, more inconsistencies began to emerge. The evidence of Arya's infidelity that Caleb cited in his rambling confessions didn't match up with her known whereabouts and activities. Co-workers at the museum vouched for Arya's dedication to her work and her evident love for her husband, painting a picture at odds with that of a cheating spouse. Perhaps most puzzling to Detective Qualley was the role of Abigail Ruffalo. While she presented herself as a grieving mother-in-law, supportive of her son, but devastated by the loss of Arya, there was something in her demeanor that set off Qualley's finely tuned investigator's instincts. Why had Abigail been at the house earlier that day? Why did her account of events leading up to the murder seem so carefully rehearsed? And why did Abigail seem more concerned with protecting her son than mourning the loss of her daughter-in-law? As the investigation entered its second week, Detective Qualley couldn't shake the feeling that Abigail Ruffalo held the key to unraveling this tragic mystery. Little did she know how deep the deception went, or how far Abigail would go to protect her web of lies. Detective Imogen Qualley had built her career on an uncanny ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. As she stood in front of the evidence board in the Hillcrest police station, that ability was being put to the ultimate test. The board was a maze of photographs, statements, and timelines, all centered around the smiling faces of Caleb and Arya Ruffalo. But it was another face that kept drawing Qualley's attention, the carefully composed visage of Abigail Ruffalo. Qualley decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing solely on the day of the murder, she began to look further back, tracing the deterioration of Caleb and Arya's relationship. It was during this process that she noticed a curious pattern. Each major argument between the couple, each instance of Caleb's growing suspicion, seemed to be preceded by an interaction with Abigail. Phone records showed long calls between mother and son, often late at night or early in the morning. Witness statements placed Abigail at or near the Ruffalo residence, with increasing frequency, in the months leading up to the murder. But the real breakthrough came when Qualley decided to look into Abigail's financial records. Hidden beneath layers of clever accounting was evidence of payments to offshore account. One payment, made just days before the murder, was to an entity known only as Phantom. Qualley's team traced this payment to a known hacker, one with a reputation for being able to fabricate digital evidence. This discovery led to a deeper dive into the proof of Arya's infidelity that had driven Caleb to his fatal actions. As they examined Arya's phone and email records, inconsistencies began to emerge. Messages that Caleb claimed to have seen were nowhere to be found in the phone's memory. Emails appeared to have been inserted into Arya's account from an external source, but perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Liam Howard, racked with guilt over his unwitting role in the tragedy, came forward to confess his part in Abigail's scheme. His testimony provided the missing link, explaining how Abigail had manufactured the appearance of an affair where none existed. Liam Howard sat in the interrogation room, his once handsome face haggard with guilt and lack of sleep. Across from him, Detective Qualley waited patiently as the young actor gathered the courage to tell his story. "Abigail was so convincing," Liam said, running a shaky hand through his hair. "She said it was to help her daughter-in-law feel more confident in social situations." As Liam's story unfolded, the full scope of Abigail's deception became clear. She had used Liam as an unwitting pawn, carefully orchestrating chance encounters with Arya and documenting them for later use. The photos she took were then skillfully edited to create the illusion of an illicit affair. It wasn't until Liam saw the news of Arya's death that he realized the horrifying consequences of his involvement. Overwhelmed by guilt, he had initially gone into hiding, terrified of what might happen if the truth came out. But as the days passed, the weight of his conscience became too much to bear. "I know I should have come forward sooner," Liam said, tears streaming down his face. "I was just so scared, but I couldn't live with myself knowing what happened to Arya. She was innocent. She didn't deserve this." Detective Qualley listened intently, knowing that Liam's testimony would be crucial in bringing Abigail Ruffalo to justice. Abigail entered the interrogation room with the same poise and confidence she had displayed throughout the investigation. "Mrs. Ruffalo, thank you for coming in," Qualley began, her tone deceptively casual. "We just have a few more questions about the day of Arya's death." For the next hour, Qualley led Abigail through a carefully constructed series of questions, slowly but surely backing her into a corner. She presented phone records showing Abigail's presence at the house earlier than she had claimed, financial documents linking her to the hacker known as Phantom, and finally, Liam Howard's damning testimony. In that moment of unguarded emotion, Abigail sealed her own fate. Her impassioned defense became a confession, pouring out in a torrent of justifications and accusations. She spoke of her fear of losing Caleb, of her certainty that Arya would eventually hurt him, of her belief that she alone knew what was best for her son. In the weeks that followed, the true extent of Abigail's machinations came to light. The community of Hillcrest, already reeling from Arya's death, was forced to confront the darkness that had been lurking beneath their picturesque small-town veneer. The trials of Caleb and Abigail Ruffalo captivated the community, shining a spotlight on the quiet town of Hillcrest and the tragedy that had unfolded there. The courthouse was packed each day, with reporters and curious onlookers jostling for a glimpse of the mother and son, whose actions had resulted in the death of an innocent woman. Caleb's trial came first. His defense team, recognizing the overwhelming evidence of his physical act, opted for a plea of temporary insanity, arguing that the elaborate deception orchestrated by his mother had driven him to a mental breaking point. After weeks of testimony from mental health experts and character witnesses, the jury found Caleb guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Abigail's trial, by contrast, was a study in calculated malice. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a manipulative, obsessive mother whose actions directly led to the death of her daughter-in-law. Despite her attempts to portray herself as a concerned parent who had simply gone too far, the jury was unconvinced. Abigail Ruffalo was found guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing brought little comfort to those most affected by the tragedy. Arya's family, present throughout both trials, spoke of the void left by their daughter's death and the difficulty of finding forgiveness in the face of such calculated cruelty. For the residents of Hillcrest, the end of the trials brought a mix of relief and lingering unease. The picturesque facade of their town had been permanently altered, the illusion of perfect safety shattered by the knowledge that such darkness could exist in their midst. The Ruffalo family tragedy serves as a somber reminder that truth, once shattered, can have consequences far beyond imagination. A lesson etched indelibly into the heart of a small Oregon town and into the annals of criminal history. At the center of this tragic tale were two individuals whose lives became inextricably intertwined. Evelyn Gosling, a 34-year-old English professor at Briarcliff Community College, was known for her brilliant mind and captivating lectures. Zane Holloway, a struggling freshman with dreams of becoming a writer, was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. What began as mentorship slowly twisted into a web of manipulation, desire, and ultimately murder. As investigators peeled back the layers of their relationship, they uncovered a dark tale of exploitation, obsession, twisted fantasies, and deadly desperation. Evelyn Gosling's journey to Briarcliff was paved with academic accolades and personal turmoil. Born to wealthy parents in Boston, Evelyn showed early signs of exceptional intelligence. Her father, a stern investment banker, and her mother, a socialite with a penchant for cocktails, provided Evelyn with every material advantage but little emotional support. From a young age, Evelyn learned to use her intellect as a shield, burying herself in books to escape the cold reality of her home life. She excelled in school, skipping 2 grades and entering Harvard. It was there that Evelyn discovered her passion for English literature and her talent for captivating an audience. After completing her PhD at Yale, Evelyn seemed destined for a prestigious position at an Ivy League institution. However, a scandal involving an affair with her married thesis advisor derailed those plans. The academic community's whispered judgments and thinly veiled rejection drove Evelyn to seek refuge in the small town of Briarcliff. At Briarcliff Community College, Evelyn quickly established herself as a rising star. Her lectures on Renaissance literature and modern poetry drew students from other departments, and her innovative teaching methods earned her the admiration of both colleagues and students. Dr. Gosling was the epitome of success, brilliant, beautiful, and dedicated to her craft. But beneath the polished exterior lay a woman haunted by her past and driven by an insatiable need for validation. Evelyn's relationships were often intense but short-lived, leaving her feeling empty and misunderstood. She craved the adoration of her students, basking in their admiration and subtly encouraging their dependence on her guidance. A psychological evaluation conducted after her arrest would later reveal a complex personality disorder characterized by narcissistic traits and a deep-seated fear of abandonment. It was this dangerous cocktail of intelligence, charisma, and unresolved emotional issues that set the stage for her fateful encounter with Zane Holloway. In him, Evelyn saw not just another student to mold, but a chance to reclaim the youth and passion she felt slipping away. Zane Holloway's path to Briarcliff Community College was far from typical. Born in a working-class neighborhood, Zane was the youngest of 4 children in a family that struggled to make ends meet. His father, a construction worker, spent long hours on job sites, while his mother juggled multiple part-time jobs to keep food on the table. From an early age, Zane found solace in the world of books. While his siblings excelled in sports and practical skills, Zane was the dreamer of the family. He would often be found scribbling stories in tattered notebooks or lost in the pages of worn paperbacks borrowed from the local library. Zane's high school years were marked by academic inconsistency. Brilliant in subjects that captured his imagination, like English and history, he struggled with the rigid structures of math and science. His guidance counselor, Ms. Ramirez, recalled, Zane had a spark of genius when it came to writing, but he lacked the discipline and confidence to truly shine. Despite his potential, Zane's grades were mediocre, and his SAT scores fell short of his aspirations. The rejection letters from his dream colleges were a bitter pill to swallow. But beneath Zane's artistic temperament lay a young man grappling with self-doubt and a desperate need for validation. It was this combination of raw talent, emotional vulnerability, and a burning desire to prove himself that made Zane the perfect target for Evelyn Gosling's manipulation. In her, he saw not just a mentor, but a gateway to the intellectual and artistic world he so desperately wanted to join. As the fall semester began, Zane could never have imagined that his pursuit of literary greatness would lead him down a dark path of ethical compromises, emotional entanglement, and ultimately to the shores of Lake Briarcliff, where his young life would be cut tragically short. The first day of advanced composition class was a turning point in both Evelyn and Zane's lives, though neither could have predicted the tragic course their paths would take. Evelyn, impeccably dressed in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, commanded the room with her presence. Her eyes scanned the sea of fresh faces, pausing momentarily on Zane, hunched in the back row, nervously fiddling with his pen. As Evelyn launched into her introductory lecture on the power of narrative, Zane found himself captivated. Her words seemed to speak directly to him, igniting a passion he had long kept buried. When she asked the class to share their favorite authors, Zane surprised himself by raising his hand. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke of his admiration for James Baldwin, earning an approving nod from Evelyn. After class, Evelyn approached Zane. She'd been impressed by his insight and encouraged him to consider submitting work to the college literary magazine. Zane, flushed with pride, stammered his thanks. This brief interaction planted the seeds of what would become a dangerous obsession for both of them. Over the next few weeks, Zane became a fixture in Evelyn's office hours. What began as discussions about assignments gradually evolved into deep conversations about literature, life, and Zane's aspirations. Evelyn, recognizing Zane's raw talent and vulnerability, began to subtly shape their interactions. She would lean in closely when reviewing his work, her perfume lingering in the air. Her feedback was a careful mix of praise and criticism, designed to keep Zane constantly seeking her approval. She shared personal anecdotes, creating an illusion of intimacy that blurred the lines of the student-teacher relationship. Zane's classmate Amelia later told investigators, "We all noticed how Dr. Gosling treated Zane differently. At first, we were just jealous of the attention, but looking back, there was something off about it." As midterms approached, Zane was struggling in his other classes. The pressure to maintain his scholarship weighed heavily on him. Sensing his distress, Evelyn made her first overt move. After a particularly long office meeting, she placed her hand on Zane's arm and spoke softly. "I see so much potential in you, Zane. I'd hate to see it go to waste because of a few difficult classes. Perhaps we could work out an arrangement to ensure your success." Zane, naive and desperate to prove himself, failed to recognize the dangerous territory he was entering. He interpreted Evelyn's offer as a lifeline, a chance to focus on his true passion without the fear of losing his scholarship. As autumn painted the Briarcliff campus in shades of gold and red, Evelyn and Zane's relationship intensified. She invited him to exclusive literary events, introducing him to her colleagues as a promising protégé. Zane, intoxicated by this new world of intellectual stimulation and perceived belonging, began to rely on Evelyn for more than just academic guidance. Evelyn, for her part, reveled in Zane's dependence. She carefully crafted every interaction to deepen his emotional attachment while maintaining plausible deniability. To her colleagues, she was merely nurturing a gifted student. To Zane, she became the center of his world. By the time the fall semester was coming to a close, the boundaries between mentor and student had become irrevocably blurred. Zane's writing, once filled with diverse influences, now mimicked Evelyn's style and preferences. His social circle had shrunk, with more and more of his time devoted to extra study sessions with Dr. Gosling. Neither Zane nor Evelyn fully realized the dangerous web they were weaving. As the winter break approached, their relationship teetered on the brink of a precipice, ready to plunge into depths from which there would be no return. The winter break marked a critical turning point in Evelyn and Zane's relationship. With the campus largely deserted, they found themselves drawn into a vortex of intensifying emotions and crossed boundaries. Evelyn, under the guise of providing additional mentorship, invited Zane to her off-campus apartment to discuss his final paper for her class. The evening began innocently enough, with Evelyn serving tea and engaging Zane in a heated debate about postmodern literature. But as the hours wore on and inhibitions lowered, the atmosphere shifted. Evelyn, her voice lowered to a near whisper, began to share personal stories of her own struggles as a young academic. She portrayed herself as a misunderstood genius, persecuted by jealous colleagues and bound by the rigid structures of academia. Zane, already in awe of Evelyn's intellect, found himself drawn deeper into her world. He saw in her a kindred spirit, someone who truly understood the artist's struggle. When Evelyn's hand brushed against his, the electric charge between them was undeniable. What happened next would be a point of contention in the later investigation. Evelyn claimed that Zane initiated the kiss, overcome by youthful passion. Zane, in his final statement, insisted that Evelyn had orchestrated the entire evening to this end. Regardless of who made the first move, that night marked the beginning of a physical relationship that would have devastating consequences. As the new semester began, Evelyn and Zane's secret affair intensified. Clandestine meetings in her office turned into long weekends at secluded bed and breakfasts. Evelyn showered Zane with gifts: rare books, expensive pens, a laptop to replace his outdated model. She framed each gift as an investment in his future as a writer, further binding him to her. Zane's grades, which had been middling in his other classes, suddenly skyrocketed. Evelyn used her influence to intervene on his behalf with other professors, painting him as a misunderstood genius who simply needed the right guidance. She promised Zane that with her help, he could secure a spot in a prestigious MFA program, bypassing the usual requirements. But as Zane's dependence on Evelyn grew, so did his anxiety. The initial thrill of their forbidden romance began to give way to guilt and fear of discovery. His writing, once vibrant and unique, became a pale imitation of Evelyn's style. His few remaining friends noticed his increasing isolation and erratic behavior. Evelyn, sensing Zane's unease, doubled down on her manipulation. She alternated between lavish praise and cruel criticism, keeping Zane in a constant state of emotional turmoil. She convinced him that their relationship was special, a meeting of twin souls that the ordinary world could never understand. In a particularly chilling move, Evelyn began to insinuate that Zane's success was entirely dependent on her goodwill. During one tense encounter in her office, she casually remarked, "It would be a shame if the ethics board were to investigate the sudden improvement in your grades. They might get the wrong idea about how you've been earning them." The implied threat was clear. Zane, trapped between his ambition and his growing sense of moral unease, began to withdraw into himself. His journal entries from this period, later recovered by investigators, paint a picture of a young man in deep emotional distress. February 15th. I don't know who I am anymore. Everything I've achieved feels tainted. But how can something so wrong feel so necessary? March 3rd. E says she's the only one who truly understands me. Maybe she's right. The thought of losing her terrifies me more than anything. As spring bloomed on the Briarcliff campus, the web of lies and manipulation had grown so thick that Zane could scarcely remember his life before Evelyn. His family, worried by his increasingly infrequent calls home, planned a surprise visit. Evelyn, paranoid about discovery, forced Zane to rebuff them, causing a painful rift. It was during this time that Zane began to confide in his roommate, Trevor. While he didn't reveal the full extent of his relationship with Evelyn, he shared enough for Trevor to become deeply concerned. Trevor's worried glances and pointed questions about Zane's relationship with Dr. Gosling would later prove to be the thread that would begin to unravel the whole sordid affair. As the semester neared its end, the pressure on both Evelyn and Zane intensified. Their relationship, built on a foundation of manipulation and false promises, was beginning to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Neither could have predicted the violent culmination that lay just around the corner, a tragic end to a romance that should never have begun. The catalyst for the tragic events that followed came in the form of a seemingly innocuous email. Dr. Fiona Sullivan, the Dean of Liberal Arts, reached out to Evelyn about Zane's remarkable academic turnaround, expressing interest in featuring him in a college newsletter. For Evelyn, this well-intentioned inquiry set off alarm bells. The thought of increased scrutiny on Zane's achievements filled her with panic. In a frenzy, Evelyn called Zane to her office after hours. The tension was palpable as she paced the room, outlining the danger they were in. Zane, already worn down by months of emotional manipulation, felt the last vestiges of his self-worth crumbling. It was in this charged atmosphere that Zane finally found the courage to confront the reality of their situation. His voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This isn't right, Evelyn. What we're doing is destroying me." Evelyn's reaction was swift and cruel. Her nurturing facade cracked, revealing the ruthless manipulator beneath. She reminded Zane of all she had done for him, how his success was entirely due to her influence. In a chilling moment, she asked, "Do you really think you'd be anything without me? You're nothing but a small-town boy with delusions of grandeur. I made you." Zane, his eyes open to the toxic nature of their relationship, felt a surge of anger and self-preservation. He shot back, "This ends now. I'm going to tell the dean everything." The color drained from Evelyn's face. Her carefully constructed world teetered on the brink of collapse. In a last-ditch effort to maintain control, she alternated between threats and pleas, reminding Zane of the consequences they would both face if the truth came to light. But something had shifted in Zane. The fog of infatuation and manipulation had lifted, revealing the stark reality of his situation. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob when Evelyn's voice, now ice-cold, stopped him. "If you walk out that door, I'll make sure you never write again." Zane paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then, without turning back, he walked out, leaving Evelyn alone with the ruins of her twisted fantasy. The following days were a blur for both Zane and Evelyn. Zane, emboldened by his decision, confided the full extent of the affair to his roommate Trevor. Together, they decided to approach Dean Sullivan with the truth. Evelyn, meanwhile, spiraled into panic. She alternated between desperate attempts to contact Zane and frantic efforts to cover her tracks. She deleted emails, shredded documents, and called in favors from colleagues to vouch for her character. As Zane prepared to meet with the dean, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Evelyn's threats echoed in his mind, but he was determined to reclaim his life and his integrity. Little did he know that Evelyn, driven to the brink by the imminent exposure of her crimes, was formulating a desperate and deadly plan to silence him forever. On the night of the murder, Zane Holloway left the library just after midnight, his mind preoccupied with the meeting he had scheduled with Dean Sullivan the following morning. As he walked along the deserted path that skirted the lake, he failed to notice the figure emerging from the shadows behind him. Evelyn Gosling had spent the day in a state of frenzied planning. Her rational mind had been overwhelmed by a toxic mix of fear, rage, and desperation. In her distorted reality, silencing Zane had become the only way to preserve the life she had built. She had waited for hours, watching the library entrance, a large rock clutched in her trembling hands. As Zane approached a secluded bend in the path, Evelyn made her move. The first blow caught Zane by surprise, sending him stumbling forward. He turned, shock and betrayal etched on his face as he recognized his attacker. "Evelyn, I trusted you," he gasped. But Evelyn was beyond reason. With a strength born of desperation, with a rock in her hand, she struck again and again while he was on the ground. Zane's attempts to defend himself were weakened by his reluctance to hurt the woman he had once admired and loved. In the aftermath of her violent act, Evelyn stood frozen, the reality of what she had done crashing over her. The fog seemed to close in, muffling the sound of Zane's body as it slid down the embankment into the dark waters of the lake. With mechanical efficiency, Evelyn began to cover her tracks. She gathered Zane's scattered belongings, wiping them clean of fingerprints before tossing them into the water. She scoured the area for any evidence that might link her to the scene. As the first light of dawn began to break through the mist, Evelyn made her way back to her apartment, her clothes sodden and muddied. Over the next few days, Evelyn attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy. She taught her classes, attended faculty meetings, all while battling the internal chaos of her guilt and fear. When Zane was reported missing, she feigned concern, even joining search parties organized by the college. But the weight of her actions took its toll. Colleagues noted her distracted demeanor and uncharacteristic nervousness. A psychology professor who had known Evelyn for years later recalled, "There was a wildness in her eyes, a tension in her movements. It was as if she was constantly on the verge of flight." Evelyn's carefully constructed alibi began to unravel almost immediately. The rock she had used as a weapon, hastily discarded in the dumpster behind her apartment building, was discovered by a maintenance worker. Security camera footage placed her car near the lake on the night of Zane's disappearance, contradicting her claim of being home all night. As the investigation intensified, Evelyn's paranoia reached new heights. She became convinced that everyone knew her secret. In a moment of panic, she attempted to flee, hastily packing a bag and withdrawing large sums of cash from her bank account. It was this erratic behavior that ultimately led to her undoing. Zane's body, weighed down by rocks, was discovered by a group of students on a weekend fishing trip. The grim discovery sent shockwaves through the Briarcliff community and marked the beginning of the end for Evelyn Gosling. The discovery of Zane Holloway's body transformed the missing person case into a full-blown homicide investigation. Detective Samantha Reeves, a veteran of the Briarcliff Police Department, took charge of the case. Her first steps were to secure the crime scene and order a comprehensive forensic analysis of the area surrounding Lake Briarcliff. The autopsy revealed that Zane had died from blunt force trauma to the head, with drowning as a secondary cause of death. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds on Zane's arms, indicating he had tried to protect himself from his attacker. As news of the murder spread, the idyllic campus of Briarcliff Community College became a hotbed of speculation and fear. Students whispered in hallways, casting suspicious glances at their peers and professors. The administration, desperate to control the narrative, held conferences assuring parents and the community that this was an isolated incident. Detective Reeves and her team began the painstaking process of interviewing Zane's friends, family, and associates. It was during these initial interviews that Zane's roommate, Trevor Lawson, provided the first crucial lead. Trevor revealed Zane's troubled relationship with Professor Gosling, including vague references to an arrangement that had left Zane increasingly distressed in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. This information led investigators to take a closer look at Evelyn Gosling. On the surface, she appeared to be a grieving mentor, distraught over the loss of a promising student. However, as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies in her story began to emerge. A breakthrough came when forensic analysts discovered traces of soil on the rock used to attack Zane that matched samples from Evelyn's garden. Additionally, security footage from a gas station near Lake Briarcliff showed Evelyn's car in the area on the night of the murder, contradicting her alibi. As the evidence mounted, Evelyn's colleagues began to come forward with their own observations. A professor from the psychology department recalled a disturbing conversation with Evelyn just days before Zane's disappearance. She seemed agitated, he told investigators. She kept talking about how she couldn't let everything she'd worked for be destroyed by a misunderstanding. The investigation took another turn when detectives uncovered a series of emails between Evelyn and Zane. While carefully worded, the subtext of these messages hinted at an inappropriate relationship. IT specialists recovered deleted drafts of emails from Evelyn's college account that were far more explicit, detailing her manipulation of Zane and her fears of exposure. The search of Evelyn's apartment yielded damning evidence. Hidden in a locked drawer, detectives found Zane's journal, which detailed the evolution of their relationship and his growing desire to end it. With the wealth of physical evidence and witness testimony, the district attorney's office felt confident in charging Evelyn Gosling with first-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community, shattering the image of the brilliant, dedicated professor and exposing the dark underbelly of power dynamics in academia. As Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, the true scope of her deception began to unravel, leaving the Briarcliff community to grapple with the question of how such a predator had hidden in plain sight for so long. Over the next several hours, Evelyn's full confession emerged, painting a disturbing picture of manipulation, abuse of power, and ultimately, murder. She spoke of her initial attraction to Zane's talent and vulnerability, how easy it had been to shape him to her will. Her voice filled with bitterness as she recounted Zane's decision to expose their relationship, describing it as a betrayal that left her no option but to silence him permanently. The trial of Evelyn Gosling was brief but intense. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, from forensic analysis to Evelyn's own confession. Despite a vigorous defense attempting to paint her as a victim of her own mental illness, the jury took only 6 hours to return a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, her voice heavy with the weight of the moment, sentenced Evelyn to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The aftermath of the trial saw significant changes at Briarcliff Community College. The administration implemented strict new guidelines governing faculty-student interactions, and mandatory training on recognizing and reporting inappropriate behavior was instituted. As Briarcliff slowly began to heal, the tragedy left an indelible mark on the community. The shores of Lake Briarcliff, once a place of tranquility and reflection, now stood as a somber reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most respectable facades, and the tragic consequences when trust is abused and power is unchecked. At the heart of this tragic tale were two sisters, Jessica and Cassandra Lawrence, whose lives had been intertwined in a complex web of love, rivalry, and resentment since childhood. Cassandra, the elder of the two, had always been the golden child, beautiful, accomplished, and married to the charming and successful architect, Dominic Blunt. Their union was the envy of Millhaven, a seemingly perfect marriage that everyone aspired to emulate. Jessica and Cassandra were born into a family of moderate means, their father a local fisherman, and their mother a schoolteacher. From an early age, it was clear that the two sisters were as different as night and day. Cassandra, with her gentle demeanor, was the pride of her parents. She excelled in school, was beloved by her teachers, and seemed to navigate the social waters of Millhaven with effortless grace. Her path in life seemed predetermined. She would go to college, find a respectable job, and settle down with a good man to start a family of her own. Jessica, however, was a force of nature from the moment she could walk. She possessed a wild spirit that both intrigued and unsettled those around her. While equally intelligent as her sister, Jessica's academic achievements were overshadowed by her rebellious nature and penchant for pushing boundaries. As they grew older, the differences between the sisters only became more pronounced. Cassandra pursued a degree in education, following in her mother's footsteps, while Jessica bounced between various majors, never quite finding her place. It was during this time that Jessica's manipulative tendencies began to surface. She would charm her way out of trouble, using her wit and allure to bend situations to her advantage. Jessica's relationships were always intense but short-lived. She seemed to thrive on the chaos of new romances, only to grow bored once the initial excitement faded. This pattern left a trail of broken hearts and bitter exes in her wake, further cementing her reputation as the black sheep of Millhaven. Cassandra, meanwhile, had returned to her hometown after college and quickly caught the eye of Dominic Blunt, a rising star in the world of architecture. Dominic had come to Millhaven to oversee the restoration of the town's historic lighthouse, but found himself captivated by the town's gentle beauty, both in its landscape and in Cassandra herself. Their courtship was swift and passionate, culminating in a fairy tale wedding that was the talk of the town for months. Dominic's career continued to flourish, and soon he and Cassandra were living in a beautiful home overlooking the ocean, their life together seeming like a modern-day fairy tale. But beneath the surface of their perfect marriage, cracks were beginning to form. Cassandra, always the dutiful daughter and wife, found herself yearning for something more. She had given up her own dreams of travel and adventure to settle in Millhaven, and a part of her resented the sacrifices she had made for the sake of her marriage. Dominic, for his part, was battling his own demons. The pressure of his high-profile career and the expectations of small-town life weighed heavily on him. He loved Cassandra deeply, but there were moments when he felt suffocated by the perfection they were expected to maintain. It was into this delicate balance that Jessica re-entered their lives. Having spent years drifting from city to city, she returned to Millhaven, claiming to want to reconnect with her roots. In reality, she was running from yet another failed relationship and mounting debts, seeking refuge in the only place she knew would take her in. Cassandra, ever the loving sister, welcomed Jessica with open arms, offering her a place to stay until she got back on her feet. But as Jessica settled into life in the Blunt household, the dynamics between the three began to shift in subtle yet profound ways. The stage was set for a drama that would shake Millhaven to its very core, forever altering the lives of all involved. At first, her presence seemed to breathe new life into Cassandra and Dominic's relationship. Evenings were filled with laughter and reminiscence as the sisters caught up on lost time, with Dominic playing the role of the attentive husband and brother-in-law. But as days turned to weeks, Jessica's true intentions began to surface. Her eyes would linger on Dominic a moment too long, her casual touches becoming more frequent and deliberate. She would find excuses to be alone with him, asking for help with her car, seeking advice on job applications, or simply catching him in the kitchen late at night when Cassandra had already gone to bed. Dominic, initially oblivious to Jessica's advances, found himself increasingly drawn to her vibrant personality. Where Cassandra was steady and predictable, Jessica was spontaneous and exciting. She listened with rapt attention to his architectural designs, asking insightful questions that made him feel truly understood. In those moments, Dominic felt a spark he hadn't experienced in years. Dominic was a man of principle, devoted to his wife and the life they had built together. He tried to distance himself from Jessica, making excuses to spend more time at the office or taking on additional projects that kept him away from home. Jessica, however, was not so easily deterred. She recognized the internal struggle in Dominic's eyes and saw it as a challenge rather than a deterrent. She began to weave a careful web of seduction, playing on his insecurities and unfulfilled desires. One evening, as Cassandra attended a school board meeting, Jessica orchestrated a seemingly innocent dinner with Dominic. She prepared his favorite meal, opened a bottle of expensive wine, and created an atmosphere of intimacy that was hard to resist. As they talked late into the night, Jessica carefully steered the conversation towards Dominic's passions and dreams, areas where she knew Cassandra had never fully connected with him. Dominic felt a rush of emotions, flattery, desire, and overwhelming guilt. He stammered a response, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Jessica had already sensed her advantage. She leaned in closer, her hand brushing against his. Don't you ever wonder what it would be like to be truly understood? To be with someone who sees you for who you really are? The tension in the room was palpable. Dominic knew he should leave, should put an end to this dangerous game before it went too far. But something kept him rooted to the spot, caught in the gravitational pull of Jessica's allure. As Jessica's lips met his in a passionate kiss, Dominic's resistance crumbled. In that moment, the foundation of his marriage began to crack, setting in motion a chain of events that would lead to unimaginable tragedy. The weeks following that fateful night were a blur of stolen moments and mounting guilt for Dominic. What had begun as a momentary lapse in judgment quickly spiraled into a full-blown affair, with Jessica and Dominic finding increasingly creative ways to be together without arousing Cassandra's suspicions. Their rendezvous ranged from hurried encounters in Dominic's office to carefully planned business trips that allowed them to escape the watchful eyes of Millhaven. Jessica reveled in the thrill of their forbidden romance, each secret meeting fueling her sense of triumph over her sister. For Dominic, the affair was an intoxicating mixture of excitement and self-loathing, each encounter leaving him both exhilarated and racked with guilt. Jessica, ever the master manipulator, knew exactly how to keep Dominic ensnared. She played the role of the perfect lover, alternating between passionate temptress and vulnerable confidant. She would listen to his frustrations about work and his unfulfilled ambitions, offering the understanding and validation he craved. "I've never met anyone like you, Dominic," she would whisper in their intimate moments. "You deserve so much more than this small town can offer you." Her words were carefully chosen, planting seeds of discontent in Dominic's mind about his life with Cassandra. She painted vivid pictures of the future they could have together, a life of excitement and passion, free from the constraints of small-town expectations. Dominic found himself increasingly torn between his growing feelings for Jessica and his loyalty to Cassandra. The double life he was leading began to take its toll, manifesting in mood swings and uncharacteristic behavior that didn't go unnoticed by his wife. At home, Dominic's guilt manifested in a mixture of emotional distance and overcompensation. There were days when he could barely look Cassandra in the eye, and others where he would shower her with affection, driven by remorse. He threw himself into his work, taking on more projects than ever before, using his career as both an escape and an excuse for his frequent absences. Jessica, for her part, played the role of the doting sister-in-law to perfection. She would engage Cassandra in long conversations, feigning interest in her day-to-day life while secretly reveling in her deception. There were moments when a flicker of guilt would cross Jessica's face, a brief recognition of the pain she was causing her sister. But these moments were quickly suppressed, overshadowed by her desire for Dominic and her deep-seated need to finally outshine Cassandra. As the affair progressed, the risks they took became greater. They began meeting in more public places, their need for each other overriding their caution. There were close calls, a neighbor who almost caught them in an embrace, a colleague of Cassandra's who saw them dining together in a neighboring town. Each near discovery only added to the intensity of their relationship, the danger becoming part of the allure. But as weeks turned to months, the strain of their deception began to show. Dominic, once energized by the affair, now found himself constantly on edge. The guilt was eating away at him, affecting his work and his relationships with friends and family. He began to question whether the passion he felt for Jessica was worth the destruction of the life he had built with Cassandra. Jessica, sensing Dominic's internal struggle, doubled down on her efforts to keep him engaged. She became more demanding of his time, more insistent in her declarations of love. Her manipulations became more overt, playing on his guilt and his desires in equal measure. As their affair reached its fever pitch, neither Jessica nor Dominic realized that their carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down. The truth, as it often does, was quietly making its way to the surface, ready to shatter the lives of all involved. While Jessica and Dominic were lost in their passionate affair, Cassandra was slowly piecing together a puzzle she never wanted to solve. At first, the changes were subtle. A lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on Dominic's clothes, hushed phone conversations that would abruptly end when she entered the room, and an emotional distance that seemed to grow with each passing day. Cassandra, ever the optimist, initially chalked these changes up to work stress or a midlife crisis. She tried to bridge the growing gap between them, planning romantic dinners and weekend getaways, only to be met with half-hearted enthusiasm from Dominic. Her sister Jessica, ironically, became her confidant during this time, offering sympathetic ears and reassurances that only served to twist the knife of betrayal deeper. But as weeks turned to months, Cassandra could no longer ignore the nagging voice in the back of her mind. She began to pay closer attention to the inconsistencies in Dominic's stories about late nights at the office and out-of-town meetings. She noticed the way Jessica's eyes would follow Dominic across a room, the barely concealed hunger in her gaze. One afternoon, while doing laundry, Cassandra found a matchbook from a hotel in a neighboring city tucked into the pocket of Dominic's jacket. A hotel she knew wasn't anywhere near his usual business haunts. The discovery sent a chill down her spine, the physical evidence making it impossible to deny her worst fears any longer. Torn between confronting her suspicions and the fear of what she might uncover, Cassandra found herself in a state of constant anxiety. She began to withdraw from friends and colleagues, unable to bear the thought of sharing her suspicions and making them real. Her sleep was plagued by nightmares, and she found herself watching Dominic and Jessica like a hawk, searching for any sign that would confirm or deny her fears. In a moment of desperation, Cassandra even considered hiring a private investigator, but the thought of strangers prying into her private life was too much to bear. Instead, she decided to confront Dominic and Jessica separately, hoping that one of them would crack under the pressure and reveal the truth. Little did Cassandra know that her decision to seek the truth would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to a confrontation more devastating than she could have ever imagined, forever altering the course of all their lives. The day of reckoning arrived on a stormy afternoon in late autumn. She had spent the morning steeling herself for this moment, rehearsing what she would say, how she would remain calm and collected in the face of potential heartbreak. When Dominic walked through the door, shaking rain from his coat, he was met with the sight of his wife standing in the room, her face a mask of barely contained emotion. The tension in the air was palpable, and he knew instantly that their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. "We need to talk," she began, her voice quavering slightly despite her best efforts. "I know about you and Jessica." The color drained from Dominic's face, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. In that moment of stunned silence, Cassandra saw the truth written plainly across his features, and her last shred of hope evaporated. "How long?" she demanded, her voice rising. "How long have you been sleeping with my sister?" Dominic's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew there was no point in denying it any longer. "Cassandra, I'm so sorry, it just happened." Cassandra cut him off with a bitter laugh. "You never meant to? What, did you trip and fall into her bed? How could you do this?" The floodgates opened, and months of pent-up suspicion and hurt came pouring out. Cassandra hurled accusations and questions at Dominic, her voice echoing through the house. Dominic, for his part, could only stand there and absorb her fury, offering weak apologies that did nothing to stem the tide of her anger. As their argument reached a fever pitch, the front door opened, and Jessica walked in, stopping short at the scene before her. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of betrayal and guilt. "Jessica, how kind of you to join us. We were just discussing your affair with my husband." Jessica's eyes darted between Cassandra and Dominic, her mind racing to find a way out of this situation. Dominic, torn between the two sisters, tried to intervene. "Please, let's just calm down and talk about this rationally." His words only served to redirect Cassandra's fury. In a fit of rage, Cassandra grabbed a vase from the coffee table and hurled it across the room, narrowly missing Dominic's head. It shattered against the wall, the crash punctuating her words. The noise seemed to snap Jessica out of her defiant stance. For the first time, a flicker of remorse crossed her face. Dominic and Jessica exchanged a look of helpless guilt before slowly making their way to the door. As it closed behind them, Cassandra collapsed onto the sofa, her body racked with sobs. The life she had known, the future she had planned, it had all crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. As the storm raged outside, Cassandra's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, shame, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. In that moment, She made a decision that would set in motion the final tragic act of this sordid drama. The bartender, a grizzled man named Hank, watched with growing concern as Cassandra knocked back drink after drink. He had seen his fair share of patrons drowning their sorrows, but something about the wild look in Cassandra's eyes set him on edge. "Another," Cassandra demanded, her words slightly slurred. Hank hesitated, but the steel in her gaze made him think better of refusing. He poured her another whiskey, neat, silently vowing it would be her last. As the night wore on, the bar emptied out, leaving Cassandra alone with her thoughts and her drinks. The alcohol had dulled the sharp edges of her pain, replacing it with a bitter resolve. Around midnight, Hank gently suggested it was time for her to head home. "Need me to call you a cab, miss?" Cassandra waved him off, fumbling in her purse for her car keys. "I'm fine," she insisted. "I just need to get out of here." Hank reached out to stop her, but Cassandra was already stumbling towards the door. As she stumbled into the parking lot, Cassandra managed to get her car started. The engine roaring to life in the quiet night. She pulled out of the parking lot, her vision blurred and her reactions dangerously slow. The winding coastal road stretched out before her, a ribbon of asphalt barely visible in the moonlight. As she drove, Cassandra's mind was a chaotic whirl of emotions: anger at Dominic and Jessica's betrayal, shame at not having seen the signs earlier, fear of the uncertain future that now lay ahead of her. The speedometer crept higher as she pressed down on the accelerator. It was on a particularly treacherous curve that disaster struck. Cassandra's dulled reflexes failed her, and she took the turn too fast. She felt the car begin to slide, tires screeching against the asphalt. In a moment of terrifying clarity, she realized her mistake, but it was too late. The guardrail gave way with a sickening crunch of metal, and suddenly Cassandra was airborne. Then darkness consumed her as the car plummeted over the cliff's edge, tumbling end over end towards the jagged rocks below. The first rays of dawn were just breaking over the horizon when Officer Liam Murphy received the call. A jogger had spotted a wrecked car at the bottom of Whispering Cliffs, a notorious stretch of coastline. Murphy, a seasoned member of Millhaven's small police force, felt a sense of dread as he made his way to the scene. The sight that greeted him was grim. The car, a silver sedan, was barely recognizable, having been crushed by the impact and battered by the waves. As the rescue team worked to extract the vehicle from its precarious position, Murphy began the somber task of piecing together what had happened. The license plate, miraculously still intact, quickly identified the car as belonging to Cassandra Blunt. Murphy felt his heart sink. He knew Cassandra, as did most people in Millhaven. The thought of delivering this news to her family weighed heavily on him. As the morning progressed, and the full extent of the tragedy became clear, whispers began to circulate through the town. Cassandra Blunt, dead in what appeared to be a drunk driving accident? It seemed impossible, completely out of character for the woman everyone knew as responsible and level-headed. Detective Sarah Watson, called in from the nearest city to lead the investigation, sensed there was more to the story. Her keen eye noted details that didn't quite add up: the lack of skid marks on the road, suggesting no attempt to brake; the odd angle of the car's trajectory off the cliff; the fact that Cassandra had been drinking alone, something her friends swore she never did. When Watson arrived at the Blunt residence to break the news, she was struck by the palpable tension in the air. Dominic Blunt's reaction to his wife's death seemed oddly muted, tinged with guilt, and the presence of Jessica Lawrence, Cassandra's sister, in the house at such an early hour raised immediate red flags. In the days that followed Cassandra's death, Detective Watson immersed herself in the investigation, peeling back layers of Millhaven's seemingly idyllic surface to reveal the turmoil beneath. Her first step was to retrace Cassandra's final hours, a task that led her to the Rusty Anchor and its reluctant bartender, Hank. Hank's account of Cassandra's state on the night of her death painted a picture of a woman in deep emotional distress. "She was knocking them back like there was no tomorrow," he told Watson. Guilt etched on his weathered face. "I tried to stop her from driving." This testimony conflicted sharply with everything Watson had heard about Cassandra from friends and colleagues. The woman they described was cautious, responsible, not someone who would drink to excess and then get behind the wheel. The detective's suspicions deepened. Watson's next focus was on Dominic Blunt and Jessica Lawrence. Their behavior since Cassandra's death had been odd, to say the least. Instead of grieving separately, they seemed to be leaning on each other for support. Their interactions, marked by meaningful glances and hushed conversations, that would abruptly cease when others approached. A breakthrough came when Watson interviewed Cassandra's closest friend, Olivia Chen. At first, Olivia was reluctant to speak ill of the dead or cause more pain to the family, but as Watson gently pressed, the floodgates opened. Cassandra had confided in me just days before it happened, Olivia admitted, her voice quavering. She suspected Dominic was having an affair with Jessica. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. Watson immediately sought to corroborate this information, digging deeper into Dominic and Jessica's recent activities. Bank records showed suspicious transactions, hotel bookings, expensive gifts that aligned with times Dominic had claimed to be on business trips. As the evidence mounted, Watson brought Dominic and Jessica in for separate interviews. Under the detectives' relentless questioning, their carefully constructed alibis began to crumble. It was Jessica who broke first. "Yes, we were having an affair," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "Cassandra found out that night. We had a huge fight, all three of us. But I swear, we didn't know she'd left the house after we went." Dominic, confronted with Jessica's confession, finally admitted to the affair but vehemently denied any involvement in Cassandra's death. "We made a terrible mistake," he said, his voice hollow with regret. "But I loved Cassandra. I would never have wanted this." Watson believed they were telling the truth about not directly causing Cassandra's death, but she knew their actions had set the tragic events in motion. The detective's report painted a clear picture. Cassandra, distraught after discovering her husband's infidelity with her own sister, had sought solace in alcohol. Her decision to drive in that state, while ultimately her own, was the direct result of the emotional trauma inflicted by Dominic and Jessica's betrayal. In the end, no criminal charges were filed in relation to Cassandra's death, but in the court of public opinion, Dominic and Jessica were already condemned. The truth of their affair spread through Millhaven like wildfire, forever tarnishing their reputations and ensuring that Cassandra's death would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As time passed, the raw pain of the events began to dull, but their impact on Millhaven remained. The town would eventually regain its outward appearance of tranquility, but its inhabitants carried with them the knowledge that beneath the calm surface of small-town life, passions and secrets could swirl with deadly force. The tragedy of Cassandra Blunt had forever changed the soul of Millhaven, leaving an indelible mark on all who called it home. Sabrina Brooks was known for her beauty and charm, qualities that had once captivated her husband, Robert. Their marriage seemed like a fairy tale, a perfect match that everyone admired. But the arrival of Robert's elderly mother, Miriam, into their home set off a chain of events that would end in unspeakable horror. Miriam was a frail but spirited woman, loved by her son and cherished by those who knew her. When Robert decided to bring her to live with them, he believed it was the right thing to do, a way to care for her in her twilight years. Sabrina, however, saw it differently. She viewed Miriam as an intruder, a threat to her domestic bliss. As tensions escalated, Sabrina's resentment turned to desperation. In a moment of madness, she concocted a deadly plan to rid herself of the woman she blamed for her misery. What followed was a chilling tale of premeditated murder, a crime that would leave an indelible mark on all who were touched by it. Sabrina and Robert's relationship began like a whirlwind romance. They met at a friend's wedding, where Robert, a successful architect, was immediately smitten by Sabrina's grace and vivacity. She worked as a freelance product photographer, and her creative spirit matched well with Robert's structured approach to life. After a brief courtship, they married and settled into a beautiful home on the outskirts of town. Miriam Brooks had lived a full life. Widowed for nearly a decade, she maintained her independence in a modest house in town. Her health had begun to decline, and Robert, ever the dutiful son, felt it was his responsibility to care for her. Miriam had always been a nurturing presence in Robert's life, and he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. Initially, Sabrina and Miriam got along well enough. Miriam was polite and grateful, and Sabrina, though slightly apprehensive, made an effort to welcome her mother-in-law. But as weeks turned into months, the strain of their living arrangement began to show. Miriam's constant presence disrupted the couple's privacy and routine, and Sabrina felt increasingly sidelined in her own home. Robert, caught between his wife and his mother, tried to balance their needs, He was patient and kind, hoping that time would ease the tension. But Sabrina's discontent only grew. She confided in her friends about the stress she was under, seeking advice on how to cope. Some suggested patience, while others hinted that Robert's loyalty to his mother might always overshadow his marriage. The situation worsened as Miriam's health declined further. She required more care and attention, which fell primarily on Sabrina during the day while Robert was at work. The constant demands wore on her, leading to frequent arguments with Robert. He, in turn, became defensive and frustrated, unable to understand why Sabrina couldn't be more accommodating. Sabrina's resentment festered, turning into a simmering rage. She felt trapped, her life overshadowed by an elderly woman who seemed to sap all the joy from her marriage. As her desperation grew, Sabrina's thoughts took a darker turn. She began to entertain the idea of a life without Miriam, envisioning the return of her once idyllic marriage. It was in these moments of bitterness and despair that the seeds of her deadly plan were sown. Robert's decision to bring Miriam into their home was not made lightly. He had seen his mother's health decline and knew she needed more support than he could provide from a distance. After long discussions with Sabrina, he convinced her that it was the best solution. Reluctantly, Sabrina agreed, though she harbored reservations about the impact on their marriage. The day Miriam moved in, Robert and Sabrina prepared a guest room with care. Robert was excited to have his mother close, and Sabrina, though uneasy, wanted to support her husband's decision. Miriam arrived with a few suitcases and a warm smile, grateful for her son's hospitality. In the beginning, the arrangement seemed manageable. Miriam was polite and tried not to impose. She kept to her room most of the time, reading or knitting, and joined the couple for meals and occasional outings. Robert was relieved to see his mother settled and safe, but Sabrina began to feel the strain almost immediately. Miriam's presence altered the dynamics of the household. Dinner conversations that once flowed easily between Sabrina and Robert now included Miriam's comments and stories. Robert's attention was divided, and Sabrina found herself missing the intimacy they once shared. The subtle shifts in their relationship gnawed at her, creating an undercurrent of resentment. The first major conflict arose over household routines. Miriam, accustomed to her way of doing things, often interfered with Sabrina's established methods. She would rearrange the kitchen, critique Sabrina's cooking, or offer unsolicited advice on housekeeping. Sabrina, who prided herself on running an efficient home, felt undermined and disrespected. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Miriam had criticized Sabrina's choice of dessert, the couple had a heated argument. Robert, exhausted from work and the constant tension, defended his mother, insisting that Sabrina was overreacting. Sabrina, feeling betrayed and isolated, lashed out, accusing Robert of always taking his mother's side. The arguments became more frequent. Robert, torn between his love for his wife and his duty to his mother, struggled to keep the peace. He tried to mediate, suggesting compromises and asking both women to be more understanding. But the underlying issues remained unresolved, and the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic. Sabrina's resentment deepened as she felt increasingly trapped in a situation she had never wanted. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, and she confided in a few about the constant stress she was under. Some offered sympathy, others advised her to stand her ground, but none could offer a solution that seemed viable. As the days turned into weeks, the initial harmony gave way to a persistent tension that permeated every aspect of their lives. The once warm and inviting home became a battleground of unspoken grievances and simmering anger. Sabrina's frustration reached a boiling point, and she began to fantasize about drastic measures to reclaim her life. Little did she know, those dark thoughts would soon manifest into a chilling reality. The tension in the Brooks household continued to rise, seeping into every corner of their lives. Miriam, oblivious to the depth of Sabrina's resentment, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She believed that with time things would improve, but Sabrina's patience was wearing thin, and her anger became harder to conceal. One morning, Sabrina discovered that Miriam had reorganized the pantry. What seemed like a minor inconvenience to Robert felt like a personal affront to Sabrina. She stormed into the living room where Miriam was sitting, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You can't just come in here and change everything. This is my house." Miriam looked up, startled. "I was only trying to help, dear. I didn't mean to upset you. It's not help when it's done without asking. You're just making things harder." Robert walked in just as Sabrina's voice rose, and he quickly stepped between them. "Sabrina, please calm down. She's just trying to help." Sabrina shot him a look of pure frustration. "You always take her side, Robert. I'm the one who has to deal with this every day." Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't about sides. We're a family. We need to work together." Despite Robert's attempts to mediate, the rift between Sabrina and Miriam grew wider. Sabrina started avoiding Miriam as much as possible, retreating to her studio to work on her graphic design projects. She found solace in her work, a temporary escape from the constant strain at home. But the escape was fleeting. Every time she left her studio, she was reminded of Miriam's presence. The small irritations accumulated, each one adding to the weight of her resentment. She began to dread coming home, the once safe haven now a source of continuous stress. Friends noticed the change in Sabrina. She became more withdrawn, her usual vibrant personality overshadowed by a constant undercurrent of tension. During a coffee outing with her close friend Julia, Sabrina finally opened up about the depth of her frustration. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Julia. She's everywhere all the time. It's like I'm living with a stranger in my own home." Julia listened sympathetically. "Have you talked to Robert about how you feel?" Sabrina let out a bitter laugh. "Talked? All we do is argue about her. He doesn't see how much it's affecting me. He just wants to keep the peace." Julia reached out and squeezed Sabrina's hand. "Maybe you need to take some time for yourself. Get away for a bit. Clear your head." Sabrina nodded, but deep down she knew that a temporary escape wouldn't solve her problems. The constant presence of Miriam in her home felt like a prison sentence, one she couldn't escape from. Her thoughts grew darker, and she began to entertain ideas she had once considered unthinkable. One night, as Sabrina lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed her mind that made her shudder. What if Miriam wasn't here anymore? The idea lingered, gaining strength with each passing day. It was a forbidden thought, one that brought a sense of both horror and twisted relief. As the days turned into weeks, the seeds of a plan began to take root in Sabrina's mind. She started researching methods to make someone ill, initially out of morbid curiosity. But the more she read, the more the idea of poisoning Miriam seemed like a viable solution to her predicament. It would be quick, discreet, and if done correctly, could appear as a natural death. Sabrina's desperation clouded her judgment. She convinced herself that this was the only way to regain control of her life and salvage her marriage. The dark thoughts that had once seemed so alien now felt like a lifeline. Little did she know this decision would lead her down a path of no return, with consequences far beyond her darkest imaginings. Sabrina's desperation reached its peak as she found herself more isolated and overwhelmed by the day. The once loving and harmonious relationship with Robert now felt like a distant memory, replaced by constant arguments and mutual resentment. She began to see Miriam not as an innocent elderly woman, but as the embodiment of all her marital problems. Confiding in friends became a regular outlet for Sabrina's frustration. During a particularly emotional conversation with her friend Lisa, Sabrina's true feelings came to the surface. "I can't do this anymore, Lisa. Every day is a battle. I feel like I'm losing myself." Lisa looked concerned. "You need to find a way to cope, Sabrina. Maybe you should see a therapist or take some time away." Sabrina shook her head. "Therapy won't change anything. The problem is Miriam. As long as she's here, nothing will get better." Lisa hesitated, then spoke softly. "Have you thought about asking her to move out? Maybe she could go to a care facility where she'd get the help she needs." Sabrina's eyes darkened. "Robert would never agree to that. He's too loyal. He'd see it as abandoning her." Lisa sighed. "I'm worried about you, Sabrina. This isn't healthy. You need to do something before it's too late." Sabrina nodded absently, but her mind was already elsewhere. She had considered every possible solution and always came back to the same conclusion. Miriam had to go. The idea of poisoning her mother-in-law, once a fleeting thought, now seemed like the only viable option. Sabrina began to meticulously plan Miriam's demise. She spent hours researching poisons, focusing on substances that would be difficult to detect. Her background in graphic design gave her an eye for detail, and she applied this skill to her dark new project. She discovered that certain plants, when ingested in small doses over time, could cause symptoms resembling a natural illness. With a plan in place, Sabrina started the next phase, obtaining the poison. She chose aconite, a potent toxin found in monkshood plants. It was a risky choice, but one that could be easily masked in food. She ordered the seeds online, ensuring they were delivered to a friend's address to avoid suspicion. The seeds arrived a few days later, and Sabrina carefully cultivated them in a hidden corner of her garden. She tended to them with a mixture of dread and determination, knowing that each day brought her closer to executing her plan. The process took weeks, during which the tension in the house continued to escalate. Miriam's health, already fragile, began to show signs of further decline. She frequently complained of stomach pains and nausea, symptoms that Sabrina dismissed with a feigned concern. Robert, ever the devoted son, grew increasingly worried, suggesting doctor visits and tests to determine the cause. Sabrina played her part well, expressing appropriate levels of worry and support. She accompanied Miriam to the doctor, reassuring Robert that they were doing everything possible. The doctors attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing health conditions, prescribing medications that did little to alleviate her suffering. The final stage of Sabrina's plan required careful timing. She waited for a day when Robert would be away for an extended period, ensuring she had the house to herself. She prepared a special meal for Miriam, infusing it with a small amount of aconite. The dose was low enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but high enough to exacerbate Miriam's symptoms. As Miriam ate the meal, Sabrina watched her with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. She felt a twisted sense of relief, believing that she was finally taking control of her life. But the act also brought a deep sense of guilt, one that gnawed at her even as she reassured herself that this was the only way. In the days that followed, Miriam's condition worsened. She grew weaker and more lethargic, her complaints of pain more frequent. Robert was beside himself with worry, while Sabrina maintained her facade of concern. The poison was doing its job, slowly but surely, and Sabrina felt both triumphant and terrified at the prospect of what she had set in motion. Sabrina's meticulous planning reached its final stages as she prepared to carry out the poisoning. The growing tension and escalating arguments with Robert only fueled her resolve. She was convinced that eliminating Miriam was the only way to restore harmony to her marriage and reclaim her life. Acquiring the aconite seeds had been a nerve-wracking process. Sabrina knew the risks involved in handling such a potent toxin, but desperation had clouded her judgment. She carefully cultivated the plants, watching them grow with a mix of dread and determination. Each step brought her closer to the point of no return. Sabrina spent hours in her studio, not working on her usual graphic design projects, but refining her plan. She researched the effects of aconite, ensuring she understood the symptoms it would produce. Vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain were common, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a severe but natural illness in an elderly woman like Miriam. Timing was crucial. Sabrina needed to administer the poison in such a way that it would slowly deteriorate Miriam's health, making her death appear as a natural progression of her existing ailments. She decided to mix small amounts of the aconite into Miriam's food over several weeks, gradually increasing the dosage. Sabrina's first attempt was a simple broth. She chose a day when Robert was working late, giving her the time and privacy she needed. Miriam, unaware of the sinister intent behind the meal, ate the broth without suspicion. Sabrina watched her carefully, noting any signs of discomfort. In the days that followed, Miriam began to complain more frequently of stomach pains and nausea. Sabrina played the concerned daughter-in-law, offering comfort and suggesting they visit the doctor. Robert, seeing Sabrina's apparent dedication, was grateful and less inclined to suspect any foul play. Sabrina continued to administer the poison, each dose carefully calculated to avoid immediate detection. She alternated the methods of delivery, sometimes mixing it into tea, other times blending it into soups or casseroles. Each meal brought Miriam closer to the brink, her health steadily declining. Despite her outward calm, Sabrina was racked with guilt and fear. The enormity of her actions weighed heavily on her, but she convinced herself that this was the only solution. She reminded herself of the life she would regain once Miriam was gone, a life free from the constant strain and arguments. Robert's increasing concern for his mother's health provided Sabrina with the perfect cover. He arranged for multiple doctor visits, each one yielding no definitive answers. The medical professionals attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing conditions, prescribing medications that did little to help. Sabrina's plan seemed to be working flawlessly. Miriam's decline was gradual, and the doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play. Sabrina's meticulous research and careful administration of the poison ensured that Miriam's symptoms matched those of a natural illness. The final dose was administered on a particularly stressful day, Robert had left for an extended business trip, leaving Sabrina and Miriam alone in the house. It was the perfect opportunity to deliver the fatal dose of aconite without immediate suspicion. The house felt unnaturally quiet, a silence that seemed to echo Sabrina's racing thoughts. Sabrina prepared Miriam's favorite soup, a creamy mushroom bisque. She measured the aconite carefully, her hand steady despite the turmoil inside her. This was it. There was no turning back. The poison, now finely ground and nearly invisible, was mixed into the soup with methodical precision. As she carried the bowl to the dining table, Sabrina forced a smile. "Lunch is ready, Miriam. I made your favorite." Miriam, looking frailer than ever, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, dear. You're so kind." Sabrina felt a pang of guilt but quickly suppressed it. She watched as Miriam slowly ate the soup, each spoonful bringing her closer to the end. The meal progressed in a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Miriam's labored breathing. As the poison took effect, Miriam's discomfort became evident. She clutched her stomach, her face contorted in pain. Sabrina maintained her facade of concern, suggesting they call a doctor. But the symptoms progressed rapidly, and soon Miriam was struggling to breathe. Sabrina dialed 911, her voice filled with feigned panic. "My mother-in-law is very ill. Please send an ambulance quickly." The paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Miriam in severe distress. They rushed her to the hospital, with Sabrina following closely behind. In the sterile confines of the emergency room, Sabrina watched as the doctors and nurses worked frantically to save Miriam. She maintained her act, shedding tears and expressing worry, but inside she felt a grim sense of relief. Despite their efforts, Miriam's condition deteriorated rapidly. The poison had done its job, and within hours Miriam passed away. The official cause of death was listed as complications from her existing health issues, exacerbated by her age. The doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play, and Sabrina's plan seemed to have succeeded perfectly. Robert was devastated when he received the news. He returned home immediately, shattered by the loss of his mother. Sabrina played the supportive wife, comforting him through his grief while hiding the dark truth. The funeral was a somber affair, with friends and family gathering to pay their respects. Sabrina's performance was flawless, her sorrow appearing genuine to all who observed, but the guilt gnawed at her. Each time Robert spoke of his mother's kindness and strength, Sabrina felt a stab of remorse. She had taken an innocent life, driven by desperation and resentment. The relief she had expected was overshadowed by the weight of her actions. She had crossed a line and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Robert threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from his grief. Sabrina, meanwhile, tried to resume her usual routines, but the shadow of her crime loomed large. She found it difficult to concentrate on her graphic design projects, her mind constantly replaying the events of that fateful day. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, but Sabrina attributed it to the stress of Miriam's death and the strain on her marriage. She continued to put on a brave face, maintaining the facade of a grieving daughter-in-law, but inside she was falling apart. One night, as she lay in bed beside Robert, the enormity of her actions hit her with full force. She had committed murder, taken a life to solve her problems, and now she had to live with the consequences. The thought was overwhelming, and Sabrina found herself trembling with a mix of fear and regret. Robert, sensing her distress, reached out to comfort her. But deep down, she knew that the truth could not remain hidden forever. The seeds of her crime were planted, and it was only a matter of time before they bore fruit. Sabrina's carefully constructed world was built on a foundation of lies, and as the days passed, she began to realize that the price of her actions would be far greater than she had ever imagined. In the aftermath of Miriam's death, life in the Brooks household settled into a somber routine. Robert's grief was palpable, and Sabrina did her best to support him, all the while masking her own turmoil. She believed she had successfully concealed her crime, but the peace she longed for remained elusive. Little did she know, the real consequences of her actions were about to unfold. The initial investigation into Miriam's death was routine. The doctors attributed her passing to natural causes, given her age and existing health conditions. However, a nurse who had been present during Miriam's final hours noticed something odd. The rapid progression of her symptoms seemed unusual, even for someone of her age. The nurse, Emma Collins, mentioned her concerns to the attending physician, Dr. Alan Harris. Emma was experienced and meticulous, not one to jump to conclusions. Dr. Harris, although initially dismissive, agreed to review Miriam's case notes. Upon closer inspection, he too found the rapid deterioration puzzling. They decided to conduct a more thorough autopsy, just to be sure. The autopsy revealed traces of a toxin in Miriam's system, something that should not have been there. Dr. Harris immediately alerted the authorities, and the case was escalated to the Greenwood Police Department. Detective Laura Rogan was assigned to lead the investigation. Detective Rogan was a seasoned investigator with a keen eye for detail. She began by interviewing the medical staff who had attended to Miriam, gathering information about her symptoms and the timeline of her decline. The discovery of the toxin raised alarm bells, and Rogan knew this was no ordinary case. Next, Rogan turned her attention to the Brooks household. She interviewed Robert first, who was devastated by the news of a potential foul play. His genuine shock and grief were evident, and Rogan quickly ruled him out as a suspect. Sabrina, however, presented a more complex picture. Sabrina was composed during the interview, expressing appropriate levels of sadness and concern. But Rogan sensed something was off. There was a guardedness in Sabrina's demeanor, a subtle tension that didn't sit right. Rogan had seen it before, the signs of someone hiding something. Sabrina, when questioned about Miriam's health, reiterated the doctor's findings. She played the role of the caring daughter-in-law, describing how she had tried to make Miriam comfortable and had taken her to the doctor multiple times. But her story seemed rehearsed, and Rogan made a mental note to dig deeper. The detectives decided to search the Brooks house, focusing on areas where they might find evidence of poison. Sabrina grew increasingly anxious as they combed through the kitchen, the garden, and her studio. She tried to maintain her composure, but the stress was evident in her trembling hands and forced calm. In the garden, the detectives found a small patch of monkshood plants, the source of aconite. Rogan's suspicions grew. She sent samples to the lab for analysis, and the results confirmed the presence of aconite, the same toxin found in Miriam's system. The breakthrough came when the detectives discovered Sabrina's internet search history. Her computer revealed extensive research on poisons, specifically aconite, and methods of administering it. The evidence was damning, painting a clear picture of premeditated murder. Rogan confronted Sabrina with the findings. In the face of irrefutable evidence, Sabrina broke down. The facade crumbled, and she confessed to the crime, her voice filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. She explained how the strain of living with Miriam had driven her to commit the unthinkable, believing it was the only way to save her marriage. The confession shocked Robert to his core. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, had murdered his mother. His world shattered, and he struggled to comprehend the depth of Sabrina's betrayal. The couple's friends and family were equally stunned, unable to reconcile the image of the charming, creative Sabrina with that of a cold-blooded killer. Sabrina's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The trial was set to begin 3 months after Sabrina's arrest. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Reed, presented a compelling case built on the extensive evidence gathered by Detective Rogan and her team. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the evidence and testimonies presented. The community held its breath, waiting for the verdict. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Sabrina was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence reflected the severity of her crime, while also acknowledging the mitigating circumstances presented by the defense. For Robert, the verdict brought a bittersweet sense of closure. Justice had been served, but the scars left by Sabrina's actions would never fully heal. The trial's conclusion marked the end of a tragic chapter for the Brooks family. Robert, now faced with the task of rebuilding his life, decided to leave Greenwood. The town, once a place of happy memories, had become a constant reminder of his loss. He moved to a different city, seeking a fresh start and hoping to find some semblance of peace. In the end, the Brooks family saga served as a stark reminder of the destructive power of desperation and the importance of compassion, understanding, and mental health support. It was a story that underscored the fragile nature of human relationships and the devastating consequences that could arise when those bonds were pushed to their breaking point. On a sweltering July afternoon in 2019, the facade of suburban bliss was shattered in a way that would haunt the community for years to come. At the center of this tragedy were the Hendersons. Thaddeus, a 45-year-old investment banker with a reputation for his work ethic and community involvement, and his wife Margot, a 43-year-old part-time yoga instructor known for her vibrant personality and infectious laugh. They had been fixtures in the community for over a decade, their seemingly perfect marriage the envy of many. Next door lived the Coopers, Elaine, a widow, and her 19-year-old son Liam, a college sophomore home for the summer. The Coopers had moved in 5 years ago, and while they kept to themselves more than most, they were generally well liked by their neighbors. No one could have predicted that these ordinary lives would collide in such a catastrophic way. Thaddeus Henderson had always been driven by ambition. Born to working-class parents in rural Iowa, he had clawed his way up the social ladder through sheer determination and an almost obsessive work ethic. By his early 30s, he had established himself as a rising star at a financial company. His colleagues admired his sharp analytical mind, and his clients appreciated his no-nonsense approach to wealth management. Margot Sinclair, as she was known before her marriage, had a different trajectory. The daughter of a college professor and an artist, she grew up in a household that valued creativity and self-expression. She studied modern dance at the university, dreaming of a career on stage. However, a knee injury in her senior year derailed those plans, leading her to pivot towards yoga and wellness coaching. Their paths crossed at a charity gala in 2003. Thaddeus, already successful but lacking in social graces, was immediately drawn to Margot's vivacity and charm. For Margot, Thaddeus represented stability and the promise of a comfortable life that would allow her to pursue her passions without financial worry. They married a year later in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of their social circle. The early years of their marriage were happy ones. Thaddeus's career continued to flourish, and he took pride in providing Margot with the life he felt she deserved. Margot, for her part, threw herself into being the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties and attending social events that were crucial for Thaddeus's networking. She also began teaching yoga part-time at an upscale studio, finding fulfillment in helping others achieve balance and inner peace. But as the years wore on, cracks began to appear in their carefully constructed life. Thaddeus's work hours grew longer, his ambition pushing him to chase ever bigger deals and clients. He was rarely home before 9 p.m., and even when he was physically present, his mind was often elsewhere, constantly checking his phone for emails or market updates. Margot, approaching her 40s, found herself increasingly restless. The yoga classes and charity committees that once filled her days now felt hollow. She began to question the choices that had led her to this point, wondering if she had traded her dreams for a gilded cage. The couple's failure to conceive, despite years of trying, added another layer of strain to their relationship. By the summer of 2019, the Hendersons' marriage was a carefully maintained facade. To the outside world, they still appeared to be the golden couple. Thaddeus continued to excel at work, recently closing a deal that put him in line for a partnership. Margot's yoga classes were more popular than ever, her students drawn to her warmth and apparent serenity. But behind closed doors they were virtual strangers. Conversations, when they happened, were perfunctory and centered around schedules and social obligations. Physical intimacy had become a rare occurrence, each touch laden with unspoken resentments and unfulfilled expectations. Neither Thaddeus nor Margot was willing to admit, even to themselves, how far they had drifted apart. It was easier to maintain the illusion, to go through the motions of a happy marriage, than to confront the emptiness that had grown between them. Little did they know that this unacknowledged chasm in their relationship was about to become the catalyst for a tragedy that would shatter not just their lives, but the entire community of Riverside. The Coopers had moved into the house next door to the Hendersons in 2014, following the death of Elaine Cooper's husband, Dr. Reginald Cooper, a respected oncologist. Reginald had succumbed to the very disease he had spent his life fighting, leaving Elaine to raise their son Liam alone. Elaine, a soft-spoken librarian, had initially struggled to adjust to life in the new community. The move from their modest home in St. Paul had been necessary to escape the memories that haunted every corner of their old house. But the affluent suburb felt alien to her. She found solace in her books and in tending to the garden that soon became the envy of the neighborhood. Liam Cooper was 14 when they moved in, a lanky, introverted teenager more comfortable with computers than with people. The transition to a new school had been difficult, and he often found himself the target of bullies who mocked his second-hand clothes and quiet demeanor. It was during this time that Thaddeus Henderson had taken Liam under his wing, offering him a job mowing lawns and doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. Over the next 5 years, Liam had blossomed. The awkward teen grew into a handsome young man, his natural intelligence finally finding an outlet in his computer science studies at the university. Despite his growing confidence, Liam remained devoted to his mother. He worried about her isolation and loneliness, and made a point of coming home most weekends, even when his friends were planning parties or road trips. It was on one of these weekend visits in early June that he first encountered Margot Henderson in a new light. Elaine had always been grateful for the Hendersons' kindness, particularly Margot's efforts to include her in neighborhood activities. She often spoke of Margot's generosity, unaware of the complex emotions brewing beneath the surface of her son's polite nods. The spark that ignited the affair between Margot Henderson and Liam Cooper was as unexpected as it was intense. It happened on a balmy evening in early June, during one of the Hendersons' legendary summer barbecues. Thaddeus, as usual, was holding court near the grill, regaling his colleagues with tales of his latest financial coup. Margot, feeling particularly isolated amidst the crowd, had retreated to the relative quiet of the pool house to replenish the ice bucket. Liam, who had been reluctantly dragged to the party by his mother, chose that moment to seek refuge from the noise and forced socializing. He entered the pool house not realizing it was occupied and found Margot struggling with a large bag of ice. Their eyes met, and in that instant, something shifted. He moved to help her with the ice, their hands brushing. They stood there, momentarily frozen, the cold of the ice contrasting sharply with the heat building between them. It was Margot who broke the silence, her voice husky as she thanked him. Liam, usually so articulate, found himself stammering in response. That brief encounter set the stage for what was to come. Over the next few weeks, Margot and Liam found themselves manufacturing reasons to be in each other's company. It started innocently enough, Margot asking Liam for help with her laptop, Liam offering to help in her garden. Each interaction was charged with an undercurrent of attraction that they both tried to ignore. Their first kiss happened almost a month after the barbecue. Liam had been helping Margot set up for one of her yoga classes in the park. As they finished, a sudden summer storm broke out. They ran for shelter under a nearby gazebo, laughing and breathless. As the rain poured down around them, Margot looked at Liam and felt a surge of desire she hadn't experienced in years. Before she could think better of it, she leaned in and kissed him. From that point, their affair escalated quickly. They were reckless, driven by a combination of Liam's youthful passion and Margot's desperation to feel alive again. They met in secluded spots around town, in the back row of the local cinema, in a hidden corner of the public library, and, most dangerously, in the Henderson home when Thaddeus was at work. Each encounter left them craving more, the gulf in their ages forgotten in the heat of their stolen moments. Margot felt rejuvenated, rediscovering parts of herself she thought long lost. Liam, for his part, was intoxicated by Margot's experience and the taboo nature of their relationship. But as the summer wore on, the strain of maintaining their secret began to show. Close calls became more frequent, a neighbor almost catching them in an embrace, a suspicious glance from Elaine when Margot's name came up too often in conversation. The guilt, too, started to weigh on them both. Liam struggled with the knowledge that he was betraying Thaddeus, a man who had been nothing but kind to him. Margot found herself lying more and more to her husband, each deception another crack in the foundation of her marriage. Yet despite the risks and the guilt, neither seemed able to end the affair. They were caught in a whirlwind of passion and need, blind to the devastating consequences that loomed on the horizon. July 15, 2019, dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. It was a Monday, and Riverside stirred to life as its residents prepared for another week of work and routine. For Thaddeus Henderson, it began like any other day. He rose early, donned one of his impeccably tailored suits, and left for the office before Margot had even stirred from sleep. Margot woke later, her mind already racing with plans for the day ahead. Thaddeus had informed her the night before that he would be working late, a crucial client dinner that could seal his partnership deal. For Margot, this meant an opportunity. She sent a text to Liam, her heart racing as she suggested he come over in the afternoon. Liam, who had been agonizing over the affair for days, saw the message as a chance to end things face to face. He replied with a simple, "Okay," resolving to break it off before the situation spiraled further out of control. The day passed slowly for both of them. Margot went through the motions of her morning yoga class, her usual serenity replaced by a nervous energy that her students couldn't help but notice. Liam, at his summer job, found it hard to focus on the lines of code on his screen, his mind constantly drifting to thoughts of Margot and the conversation to come. At 2:30 p.m., Liam made his way next door, glancing furtively around to ensure none of the neighbors were watching. Margot ushered him in quickly, her face flushed with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. It was Liam who broke the silence, starting to say that they needed to talk. But Margot, misreading his intention and driven by a desperate need to feel desired, cut him off with a passionate kiss. Despite his reservations, Liam found himself responding, his resolve weakening in the face of Margot's intensity. What happened next was a blur of discarded clothes and tangled limbs. As they made their way to the master bedroom, all thoughts of ending the affair were temporarily forgotten as they lost themselves in each other. Meanwhile, across town, Thaddeus Henderson sat in his office frowning at his computer screen. The numbers for the client presentation weren't adding up, and he knew he'd have to redo a significant portion of his work. Frustration mounting, he made a snap decision. He would go home, regroup, and return to the office later to finish up before the dinner. At 3:45 p.m., Thaddeus's car pulled into the driveway. He noticed Liam Cooper's beat-up Honda parked a little way down the street, but thought nothing of it. Probably helping Elaine with some errand, he mused as he unlocked the front door. The house was quiet as Thaddeus entered, but something felt off. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the coffee table, unusual for Margot at this hour. Then he heard it, a muffled sound coming from upstairs. Frowning, he climbed the stairs, the noise growing louder as he approached the master bedroom. What Thaddeus saw when he opened the door would be forever seared into his memory. His wife, the woman he had loved for 15 years, was in their bed with Liam Cooper, the 19-year-old guy he had mentored and trusted. Then, with a roar of rage and pain, Thaddeus lunged forward. His hands, so used to manipulating numbers and shaking on business deals, now curled into fists as he grabbed Liam, yanking him off the bed. Margot screamed, scrambling to cover herself and separate the two men, but her efforts were in vain. Thaddeus's first punch caught Liam squarely in the jaw, sending the younger man stumbling backward. For Liam, driven by adrenaline and fear, fought back. The two men grappled, crashing into the dresser, sending framed photos and trinkets scattering across the floor. In the chaos, no one noticed the heavy crystal bookend that fell from the dresser's top. No one saw it until Thaddeus, in a fit of blind rage, grabbed it and brought it down on Liam's head with a sickening thud. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. Liam crumpled to the floor, blood pooling rapidly around his motionless form. Margot's scream pierced the air as the full horror of what had just transpired hit them all. In that moment, as storm clouds gathered outside and sirens wailed in the distance, the lives of everyone involved changed irrevocably. The idyllic facade of Riverside had been shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the usual tranquility of the community. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, curiosity mingling with apprehension, as squad cars and an ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the Henderson residence. The first officers on the scene were met with a tableau of horror that would haunt them for years to come. Inside, they found a shell-shocked Thaddeus Henderson, his hands covered in blood, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. Margot barely clothed and hysterical. The room bore all the hallmarks of a violent struggle: overturned furniture, shattered glass, and smears of blood on the hardwood floor. Detective Ava Rossi, a veteran of the police department's homicide unit, took charge of the scene. Her first priority was securing medical attention for Liam Cooper. As paramedics worked feverishly to stabilize him, Rossi began the delicate process of piecing together the events that had led to this tragedy. Thaddeus, still in a state of shock, was taken into custody without resistance. Margot was separately questioned. Their stories, fragmented and emotional, painted a picture of a long-simmering marital discord that had exploded into violence. As word spread through the neighborhood, a crowd began to gather at the police cordon. Among them was Elaine Cooper, who collapsed in grief when informed of her son's critical condition. She was quickly whisked away to the hospital, where Liam was fighting for his life in the intensive care unit. The investigation moved quickly. Forensics teams combed through the Henderson home, collecting evidence and taking photographs. The crystal bookend, now a potential murder weapon, was carefully bagged and tagged. Neighbors were interviewed, their statements adding context to the relationships between the Hendersons and the Coopers. One neighbor recalled hearing raised voices from the Henderson house earlier that afternoon, but had dismissed it as a television playing too loudly. Another mentioned seeing Liam enter the Henderson home around 2:30 p.m., noting it because he thought it odd given Thaddeus's usual work schedule. As night fell, the gravity of the situation became clear. Liam Cooper was pronounced dead at 9:47 p.m., never having regained consciousness. The charge against Thaddeus Henderson was elevated from assault to second-degree murder. In the days that followed, more details emerged. Margot, racked with guilt and facing intense scrutiny, admitted to the affair with Liam. Her statement, given through tears at the police station, provided a timeline of their relationship and the events leading up to that fateful afternoon. Thaddeus, advised by his hastily retained attorney, remained silent, but his colleagues at the company painted a picture of a man under immense pressure, working long hours in pursuit of a partnership that had seemed within reach. None, however, had suspected the depth of his marital problems or the capacity for violence that had been unleashed. The case against Thaddeus Henderson was building, but Rossi knew that in the court of public opinion, there would be no clear villains or heroes in this story. Only victims, each in their own way, of the secrets and lies that had finally come to light in the most devastating manner possible. For no one has ever expected the plot twist that's about to come. And twist that will shock everyone, including the Hendersons. The Henderson trial began on a crisp autumn morning, 6 months after the events that had shaken Riverside to its core. The county courthouse, a stately building of red brick and white columns, was surrounded by reporters and curious onlookers. Inside, the tension was palpable as the judge called the court to order. Prosecuting attorney Veronica Talbot, known for her sharp mind and even sharper tongue, laid out the state's case in her opening statement. She painted a vivid picture of Thaddeus Henderson as a man consumed by rage and jealousy, who had brutally murdered a young man in the prime of his life. Talbot's words were measured but impactful, her gaze sweeping across the jury as she promised to prove Henderson's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Defense attorney countered with a narrative of his own. He portrayed Thaddeus as a devoted husband and pillar of the community, pushed to the brink by a betrayal of the deepest kind. Sterling suggested that the death was a tragic accident, the result of a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Forensic experts testified about blood spatter patterns and the force required to cause Liam's fatal injury. Neighbors recounted the events of that day, and character witnesses spoke to the personalities and reputations of both Thaddeus and Liam. But it was Margot Henderson's testimony that captivated the courtroom. Over 2 grueling days on the stand, she laid bare the disintegration of her marriage and the evolution of her relationship with Liam. Her voice trembled as she described the moment Thaddeus had walked in on them and the horror of watching the confrontation unfold. Under cross-examination, Sterling tried to paint her as an unfaithful wife whose actions had driven her husband to temporary insanity. But Margot held firm, accepting her part in the tragedy while insisting that nothing justified Liam's death. Elaine Cooper's testimony was brief but powerful. Still grief-stricken, she spoke of her son's kindness and his dreams for the future, all cut short in an act of violence. Her quiet dignity in the face of unimaginable loss moved many in the courtroom to tears. As the trial neared its end, all eyes turned to Thaddeus Henderson. Against his lawyer's advice, he chose to take the stand. His testimony was a study in contrasts, moments of apparent remorse interspersed with flashes of the anger that had led to Liam's death. He spoke of the pressure he'd been under at work, the growing distance in his marriage, and the shock of discovering his wife's infidelity. When describing the fight with Liam, Thaddeus claimed he had never intended to cause serious harm, that he had simply lost control. As the trial progressed, expert witnesses from the field of psychology were called to provide insight into the minds of those involved in the tragic events. Dr. Cho explained that Thaddeus's actions could be understood through the lens of what psychologists call intermittent explosive disorder, characterized by episodes of violent, aggressive behavior disproportionate to the situation. She pointed to Thaddeus's high-stress job, his unexpressed marital dissatisfaction, and the shock of discovering his wife's infidelity as contributing factors to his violent outburst. However, under cross-examination, Dr. Cho conceded that while these factors could explain Thaddeus's behavior, they did not excuse it. She emphasized that many individuals face similar stressors without resorting to violence. The defense called a specialist in marriage and family therapy to testify about the psychological impact of infidelity. Friedman described the profound sense of betrayal and loss of identity that a person may experience upon discovering a spouse's affair. He likened it to a form of psychological trauma, capable of triggering extreme emotional responses. The psychological analyses presented during the trial offered a complex picture of human behavior and motivation. They highlighted how a combination of personal history, societal expectations, and immediate circumstances can collide to create a perfect storm of tragedy. After 7 grueling weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments, the fate of Thaddeus Henderson rested in the hands of the jury. As Judge Blackwell sent the 12 men and women to deliberate, a tense silence fell over the courtroom. After a short recess to consider all factors, Judge Blackwell returned to deliver her sentence. Citing the violent nature of the crime balanced against Thaddeus's lack of prior criminal history and the unique circumstances of the case, she sentenced him to 18 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. As Thaddeus was led away in handcuffs, the full weight of the tragedy seemed to descend upon the courtroom. There were no victors here, only lives irrevocably altered by a moment of passion and a split second of violence. Outside, as news of the verdict spread, the crowd's reactions were mixed. Some felt justice had been served, while others argued the sentence was too harsh or too lenient. But all agreed on one thing: the events that had unfolded in Riverside would leave an indelible mark on the community for years to come. In the quiet streets of Oak Ridge Heights, a picturesque suburban enclave, the Blackwood residence stood as a beacon of domestic bliss. To the casual observer, Zephyr and Lorelei Blackwood epitomized the American dream: successful careers, a beautifully maintained craftsman home, and a marriage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Their neighbors often remarked on the couple's apparent devotion to one another, evidenced by their frequent dinner parties and synchronized jogging routines. But beneath the polished veneer of their seemingly perfect life, the Blackwoods harbored a secret that would ultimately lead to their undoing. For the past 2 years, Zephyr and Lorelei had been active participants in a local swinging community, a lifestyle choice that promised to add excitement and passion to their decade-long marriage. At first, their foray into the world of consensual non-monogamy seemed to reinvigorate their relationship. They spoke of feeling closer, more honest, and more in love than ever before. However, as with many things that glitter, the reality of their chosen path was far more complex and fraught with danger than either could have anticipated. What began as a mutual adventure in sexual exploration would eventually expose deep-seated insecurities and long-buried resentments. This is the story of how a couple's search for excitement and fulfillment led to jealousy, rage, and murder. Zephyr Blackwood was a rising star in the tech scene. With his sharp intellect and innovative ideas, he had quickly climbed the corporate ladder at a leading software company. Colleagues described him as driven, charismatic, and occasionally intense. Standing tall in a runner's physique, Zephyr turned heads wherever he went. Despite his professional success, those closest to him noted a persistent undercurrent of insecurity, stemming from a childhood marked by his parents' messy divorce and his father's subsequent absence. Lorelei Blackwood was Zephyr's perfect complement. A talented freelance graphic designer, she balanced her husband's Type A personality with her more laid-back, creative approach to life. With her warm eyes, infectious laugh, and curves that defied her dedication to yoga, Lorelei was the kind of person who made friends easily and kept them for life. Growing up in a large, boisterous family, she valued connection and openness above all else. The couple met during their senior year at the university. Zephyr was immediately drawn to Lorelei's free spirit and artistic talent, while she found herself captivated by his ambition and hidden vulnerability. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a beachside proposal just 6 months after graduation, and they married a year later in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of their social circle. For the first 7 years of their marriage, Zephyr and Lorelei seemed to have it all. They traveled extensively, built successful careers, and created a home that was the envy of their friends. However, as they approached their mid-30s, a sense of restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but uninspiring glow. It was Lorelei who first broached the subject of exploring new avenues in their sex life. Always the more sexually adventurous of the two, she suggested they attend a few workshops on tantric practices and BDSM. Zephyr, eager to please his wife and reignite their spark, agreed enthusiastically. These workshops opened up new channels of communication between the couple, and they found themselves discussing fantasies and desires they had never before shared. It was during one of these conversations that the topic of swinging first arose. Lorelei had read about it online and was intrigued by the idea of consensual non-monogamy. Zephyr, initially hesitant, warmed to the concept as Lorelei painted a picture of increased intimacy and shared adventures. After months of discussion, research, and soul-searching, the Blackwoods decided to take the plunge. They created profiles on swinger websites, attended a few meet-and-greet events, and finally participated in their first full swap with another couple. The experience was exhilarating, and for a time it seemed to breathe new life into their marriage. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. The Blackwoods' entry into the world of swinging was marked by a mix of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. Their first experience, a soft swap with a couple they met through a reputable swinger website, exceeded their expectations. The evening was filled with laughter, flirtation, and a level of sexual tension that neither Zephyr nor Lorelei had experienced in years. As they drove home, hands intertwined, they couldn't stop grinning at each other, already planning their next encounter. Over the next few months, Zephyr and Lorelei became regulars in swinging scene. They attended parties at upscale clubs, participated in intimate gatherings at private homes, and even organized a few events of their own. Their social circle expanded rapidly, filled with like-minded couples who shared their desire for excitement and sexual exploration. Lorelei, in particular, thrived in this new environment. Her natural charisma and open-mindedness made her a favorite among their swinging friends. She reveled in the attention she received from both men and women, and her confidence soared. Zephyr, too, seemed to flourish initially. He enjoyed the ego boost that came from other women finding him attractive, and he took pride in having a wife that others desired. The couple's sex life, both with others and between themselves, reached new heights of passion and intensity. They found themselves experimenting with fantasies and kinks they had never before considered. Lorelei would often joke that they were having more sex now than they did in their first year of marriage. As they became more comfortable with the lifestyle, the Blackwoods began to form deeper connections with some of the couples they met. They particularly clicked with Ether and Nova Sterling, a pair of free-spirited artists who had been in the swinging scene for years. The four of them often got together for dinner and drinks, which would invariably lead to steamy encounters that left everyone satisfied. However, as the months wore on, subtle changes began to occur in the dynamics of Zephyr and Lorelei's relationship. While Lorelei continued to embrace the lifestyle with enthusiasm, Zephyr started to show signs of discomfort. He began to notice the way other men looked at his wife, the ease with which she flirted and connected with their swinging partners. What had once been a source of pride now stirred uncomfortable feelings in the pit of his stomach. Zephyr found himself paying closer attention to Lorelei's interactions, especially with Ether Sterling. He couldn't help but notice the lingering touches, the inside jokes, the way Lorelei's eyes seemed to light up in Ether's presence. Rational thought told him that this was all part of the game, that Lorelei always came home with him at the end of the night. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts and fueled his growing insecurity. Despite his misgivings, Zephyr kept his feelings to himself. He didn't want to disappoint Lorelei or appear weak in front of their new friends. Instead, he threw himself into the lifestyle with renewed vigor, as if trying to prove something to himself and others. He initiated more encounters, suggested wilder scenarios, and pushed his boundaries further than he was truly comfortable with. Lorelei, caught up in the excitement and new experiences, failed to notice the subtle changes in her husband's behavior. She interpreted his increased enthusiasm as a sign that he was enjoying the lifestyle as much as she was. In her mind, swinging had brought them closer together, opening up new avenues of communication and shared experiences. As their second anniversary in the lifestyle approached, the Blackwoods were seen as a success story in their swinging circle. They were attractive, fun, and seemingly more in love than ever. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discord had been sown. The very lifestyle that had reinvigorated their marriage was now silently driving a wedge between them, setting the stage for the tragic events that were to come. The first signs of trouble in the Blackwoods' seemingly perfect arrangement appeared subtly at first. Zephyr began to make offhand comments about cutting back on their swinging activities, suggesting they focus more on their own relationship. Lorelei, interpreting this as a passing mood, gently brushed off his concerns and encouraged him to embrace the freedom and excitement they had discovered. As weeks passed, Zephyr's jealousy grew more pronounced. He started to question Lorelei about her interactions with other men, particularly Ether Sterling. His inquiries, initially casual, became more frequent and intense, where once he had enjoyed watching Lorelei with other partners, he now found himself averting his eyes, a knot forming in his stomach. Lorelei, for her part, struggled to understand the change in her husband. She repeatedly assured him of her love and commitment, emphasizing that their adventures in swinging were purely physical and did not threaten their emotional bond. But her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Zephyr's insecurities deepened. The tension between them began to spill over into their daily lives. Arguments that started about swinging quickly devolved into broader accusations and recriminations. Zephyr would bring up past grievances, questioning Lorelei's fidelity even before they entered the lifestyle. Lorelei, frustrated by what she saw as Zephyr's irrational behavior, found herself becoming defensive and withdrawn. Their professional lives started to suffer as well. Zephyr, usually laser-focused at work, became distracted and irritable. His colleagues noticed the change, whispering about possible troubles at home. Lorelei, whose work required creativity and a positive outlook, found it increasingly difficult to meet deadlines and satisfy clients. Despite the growing discord, Lorelei was reluctant to give up the lifestyle that had brought her so much joy and self-discovery. She suggested they take a break from group activities and focus on one-on-one encounters, hoping this would ease Zephyr's jealousy. But even this compromise led to conflict, with Zephyr accusing Lorelei of trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. As their arguments intensified, the Blackwoods' facade of domestic bliss began to crumble. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, Zephyr suggested they seek counseling. Lorelei agreed, hoping that a professional could help them navigate the complex emotions stirred up by their foray into non-monogamy. However, finding a therapist who was both qualified and non-judgmental about their lifestyle proved challenging, further adding to their frustration. As the date of an upcoming swinger party hosted by the Sterlings approached, the tension in the Blackwood household reached a fever pitch. Lorelei was determined to attend, seeing it as an opportunity to reconnect with friends and reaffirm their place in the community. Zephyr, conflicted and resentful, reluctantly agreed to go, setting the stage for the tragic events that would unfold. The evening of May 15th dawned warm and clear, a perfect spring day. As twilight approached, the Blackwoods began preparing for the Sterlings' party, with an undercurrent of tension thrumming between them. Lorelei hummed to herself as she applied her makeup, choosing a slinky black dress that accentuated her curves. Zephyr, watching her from the doorway, felt a familiar mix of desire and dread coiling in his stomach. They arrived at the Sterlings' upscale loft just as the party was getting started. The spacious apartment was bathed in soft, colorful lights, with sensual music pulsing through hidden speakers. Couples and singles mingled, drinks in hand, the air thick with anticipation and pheromones. Nova Sterling, resplendent in a shimmering gold jumpsuit, greeted them warmly. Zephyr couldn't help but notice how her embrace with Lorelei lingered, the two women exchanging knowing smiles. Ether appeared moments later, clapping Zephyr on the back before placing a gentle kiss on Lorelei's cheek. The knot in Zephyr's stomach tightened. As the night progressed, Zephyr found himself growing increasingly agitated. He watched as Lorelei flitted from group to group, her laughter carrying across the room. She seemed to be in her element, radiating confidence and sensuality. In contrast, Zephyr felt awkward and out of place, nursing the same drink for hours as he observed the interactions around him. The party began to shift gears as couples started to pair off or form small groups, disappearing into the various playrooms the Sterlings had set up. Zephyr lost sight of Lorelei for a while, his anxiety spiking as he searched the crowded loft. He finally spotted her in deep conversation with Ether, their heads close together as they spoke in low tones. Unable to contain himself any longer, Zephyr approached the pair. He caught the tail end of their conversation, something about meeting up later in the week for coffee. Lorelei's eyes widened slightly as she noticed Zephyr, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she composed herself. Zephyr, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, suggested it was time to leave. Lorelei protested, arguing that the night hasn't ended. Their disagreement, though conducted in hushed tones, drew curious glances from nearby guests. Ether, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over, but his intervention only seemed to irritate Zephyr further. As the argument threatened to escalate, Nova appeared, smoothly inserting herself into the situation. With practiced ease, she guided Zephyr and Lorelei to a quiet corner of the loft, encouraging them to take a moment to cool off. She offered them water and gentle words of advice, reminding them of the community's emphasis on open communication and mutual respect. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Nova's intervention had diffused the situation. Zephyr took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. Lorelei reached out, squeezing his hand in a conciliatory gesture. But as they stood to rejoin the party, Zephyr caught sight of Ether watching them intently. Something in the other man's gaze, concern, pity, or perhaps something else entirely, caused Zephyr's tenuous control to snap. In a cold, clipped voice, he announced that he and Lorelei were leaving. This time, Lorelei didn't argue. She could see the storm brewing behind Zephyr's eyes and knew that staying would only lead to a scene. Apologizing profusely to Nova and avoiding Ether's gaze, Lorelei allowed Zephyr to lead her out of the loft. The drive home was fraught with silence, the tension between them so thick it was almost suffocating. Lorelei stared out the window, her earlier vivacity replaced by a wary exhaustion. Zephyr gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched as he navigated the nearly empty streets. As they pulled into their driveway, neither made a move to exit the car immediately. For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. Finally, Lorelei turned to Zephyr, her voice soft but firm as she said, "We need to talk about this. We can't go on like this." Zephyr nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Without a word, he got out of the car and headed for the front door. Lorelei followed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the conversation to come would likely change their lives forever. Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be. As soon as the front door closed behind them, the facade of calm they had maintained in public crumbled. Zephyr rounded on Lorelei, his face contorted with a mix of anger and pain. The words tumbled out of him in a torrent of accusations and grievances, all the doubts and fears he had been harboring for months, finally finding voice. He raged about her behavior at the party, the way she had flirted openly with Ether and others. He brought up past encounters,